Chapter 31 Black Family Reunion 2. Everyone stayed awake until the next day, waiting for the Aurors to arrive, but they never came, which surprised everyone, given that it was an obvious place to hide after an escape given the political complications they would have when searching the Black Manor. That's strange, they should have arrived long ago, Narcissa spoke, stroking Asterion's hair, his head resting on her lap. Her fingers gently traced the silky dark strands that easily slipped between her fingers. Maybe they focused on the other prisoners. Asterion replied, enjoying the strokes on his head, his voice slightly sleepy. He hadn't slept much last night, so he was almost drifting off to sleep with her touch. Everyone fell silent. Why release all the prisoners, to create more chaos? Narcissa asked Bellatrix in a slightly lower voice, apparently afraid of disturbing Asterion, who was almost asleep. I didn't release anyone besides the little puppy, it was Rodolphus who did it. He seemed particularly keen on killing me, although I don't understand why. Reclining on the sofa in a carefree manner, Bella spoke, staring at the ceiling as she counted how many imaginary stabs she had delivered to the sheep. Her eyes narrowed with a malicious and sadistic look, as if recalling something interesting. Sirius rolled his eyes at Bella's comment. She obviously knew the reason but pretended to be unjustly treated. Arcturus frowned. He looked at Bellatrix with a deep gaze, showing clear dissatisfaction. Both his great-niece's marriages were troubled, and he wondered if he had made a mistake in choosing their spouses. By the way, I'm surprised that my master is the son of Regulus. My first thought upon learning of his divine existence was to think he was Sirius's son. Bella spoke at that moment, subtly changing the subject. She felt she would be reprimanded by Arcturus if she continued to mention her ex-husband. Everyone deliberately ignored Bellatrix calling Asterion master, and revering him as a god. Me too, Narcissa agreed with her sister's words. Arcturus merely nodded in agreement as he took a sip of his tea. Why? Asterion looked confusedly at everyone. Bella laughed loudly and spoke with a malicious smile on her lips. Sirius is a sexual libertine. As long as there's a pussy, I dare say he wouldn't hesitate to stick his dick in without a second thought. Sirius, who had been silently quiet, didn't expect to be insulted at this moment. He felt like a dagger had struck his heart, causing unknown emotional damage. I lost count of how many times I had to go to Hogwarts to deal with his sexual scandals. Arcturus looked at Sirius with disappointment and shook his head. Ouch, another imaginary arrow pierced Sirius's heart. Remember, Asti, don't learn anything from him. This man is scum who only thinks with his lower head. This kind of man doesn't live for long, Narcissa warned Asterion sternly, who nodded in agreement with her words. Ouch, someone who can't control their own desires is no different from an animal that only follows instinct, Asterion spoke, delivering another emotional blow to Sirius. Sirius was now lying on the sofa, defeated and powerless, with a bitter and painful smile on his face. I was young and didn't know what I was doing, Sirius spoke in his defense, but everyone, except Asterion, turned their gazes to him, a look of disdain and contempt. You were chased out half-naked by Lord Shafiq when he found you in bed with his wife, Narcissa replied coldly, her gaze not hiding the antipathy she felt at the moment. What else could he say? Sirius simply lay on the sofa, wishing to find a hole to bury himself in with the shame he felt at the moment. What did his nephew think of him now? Bellatrix just laughed at her cousin's misery, not hiding the pleasure she felt in seeing him suffer. 15 days later, with less than 2 weeks until the Masquerade Ball, Asterion entered the living room to find Arcturus, Narcissa, Bellatrix, and Sirius gazing at painted portraits of 5 girls around the same age, between 9 and 10 years old. What's going on? Asterion asked, confused. Your potential future wives, Narcissa replied, not taking her eyes off the papers containing all the information about the girls. Asterion looked surprised at the 5 portraits, 2 redheads, 1 blonde, and 2 brunettes. This is so outdated, let the boy choose who he'll share his life with on his own, Sirius said, taking a large gulp of wine from the glass he held. He seemed pleased with the taste of the wine. To be like you, single at 31, Narcissa retorted sarcastically. Ouch! Sirius placed his hand on his chest and said with a sad tone. That was cruel, sissy. Then, he took another sip of wine at 8 in the morning. She just scoffed and looked at Asterion with a gentle gaze and asked. Any preference, Asti? He pondered for a moment and said. Maybe someone like Sissy. Elegant, cold and strong, I don't want a pretty vase for decoration. Sitting on the sofa, he crossed his legs one over the other and continued speaking. Instead of illusory love, I prefer companionship. Almost everyone looked strangely at the almost 10-year-old boy. They couldn't believe they heard such words from someone so young. Wasn't it normal for someone his age to think about love that way? Narcissa felt mixed feelings about his words. She was glad that he wanted someone like her, but at the same time, sad for his pragmatic view of life. But the entire silent atmosphere was shattered by Bellatrix's words. Stroking her chin, Bellatrix wore a pensive look and thought aloud. I think I meet all the requirements, should I marry my master? You're 39, Bella, Narcissa spoke, looking coldly at her sister with a slightly hostile gaze. Age is just a number, the prison just an exotic room. Offended, Bella retorted, rising from the sofa. That doesn't change the fact that you're old, mocked Narcissa. You meant to say I'm a mature woman, said Bellatrix, her tone dangerously sharp. She hated when people mentioned her age. Enough of this childish argument. You're not children, Arcturus intervened at this point, his voice strong and grave, calming the two. Narcissa and Bellatrix exchanged cold glances and sat back down. Bellatrix muttered loud enough for everyone to hear her murmur. Sissy, the possessive, is back. Remembering how Narcissa used to be as a child, the girl wouldn't let anyone play with her dolls. Especially her, not that Narcissa was wrong, all of Bellatrix's dolls met a tragic end, all of them being decapitated, dismembered, and buried. Narcissa glared at her sister with a deadly cold look but remained silent due to Arcturus' presence. According to your preferences, you have two options, Daphne Greengrass, a young witch of semi-grade 2, or Susan Bones, a grade 3 witch, both powerful for their age and likely to reach grade 1, especially Miss Greengrass, who has the potential for semi-special grade. In addition to them, Pansy Parkinson is also suitable, although her talent is slightly lower than the other two. Politically, Susan Bones is the niece of Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. On the other hand, Daphne Greengrass is the heir to the prestigious Greengrass family, controlling a good portion of Britain's magical resources. According to the report I received about their personalities, Susan is more timid and reserved, while Daphne, on the other hand, bears a resemblance to Narcissa. Arcturus finished speaking and looked at Asterion, waiting for him to respond. Asterion couldn't help but think about Susan. She wasn't his type, her red hair might attract him, but that was about it. As for political power by marrying her, it wasn't much to begin with. The Bones family was only strong because of Amelia Bones. Once she left her position, the Bones family wouldn't be as important as it was now. Besides, with Amelia's personality, it would be difficult to gain any privilege. She was known to be impartial and cold. There was no way she could help with anything if he married her niece. On the other hand, Daphne was the heiress to the Greengrass family, both politically and economically. She was indeed the better choice. Combine that with what Arcturus described, and he had a future wife. But Asterion looked at Arcturus and asked, which of the 5 girls would be most beneficial for House Black to marry? This question brought a smile to the old patriarch's face. There was nothing that made him happier than seeing Asterion prioritize the family over his own interests. That was how the family would continue to stay strong, with family interests always coming first. Parkinson and Greengrass. Both control strategic materials, House Parkinson with alchemical items and House Greengrass with potion ingredients. Everyone in the room looked at Asterion, awaiting his response. To Sirius, his nephew might be experiencing life before marriage, but seeing how he conducted himself, he knew the boy was a true pureblood, unlike himself. Asterion pondered, weighing the pros and cons, but with a touch of selfishness on his part, he finally spoke up. Daphne Greengrass should be more suitable. Narcissa wore a displeased expression on her face, although it didn't show. She followed the pure-blood ideology. The Greengrass family, on the other hand, was quite liberal with their marriages, regardless of whether they were half-blood or Muggle-born. However, as it was Asterion's choice, she remained silent. I still think I'm more suitable. Bellatrix muttered in the background, but everyone ignored her. Chapter 32 Masquerade Ball 1. On the night of the Masquerade Ball, Asterion stood before the full-length mirror, clad in an elegant dark green suit adorned with delicate silver lines resembling the thorns of a rose, scattered across the chest area and sleeves of the jacket. A white scarf wrapped around his neck served as a tie, fastened by a dazzling ruby-studded golden brooch. The mask covering his face was dark in color, evoking the image of a demonic being with 10 red eyes, while black feathers on either side resembled the wings of a fallen angel. What do you think, Bella? Asterion asked the stunning woman, who was seated in a manner unfit for a lady. Diabolically beautiful, master, so much so that I want to lock you up in my basement, replied Bellatrix to Asterion, looking him up and down as if he were a succulent piece of meat. Her tongue seductively slid over lips stained with crimson lipstick. Asterion remained indifferent to the advances of his beautiful cousin. He had grown accustomed to the perversions of his crazy cousin, who didn't even care about his age. Honestly, it wasn't all that bad. These seduction attempts helped him prepare for the future, especially when he expected to deal with women trying to seduce him, increasing his resistance to such charms. He knew that beautiful women were one of the most dangerous things in the world. Sitting elegantly in his chair, he lightly tapped his legs, drawing the woman's attention. Bellatrix's eyes lit up, and she rose from the couch, kneeling beside the chair with her head on his lap. Asterion merely smiled and gently stroked her hair with tenderness. You're truly someone starved for attention, Asterion said gently as he admired Bellatrix's beautiful face. Even nearing 40 years old, due to magical energy, her aging had been slowed down, making her appear like a young woman of 25. Bellatrix pouted her lips upon hearing her master and spoke comfortingly, feeling his caresses in her hair. It's not my fault, master. Rarely did anyone love me. I see your husband didn't please you, sighed Asterion. Political marriages were like that. He himself didn't expect love, but he didn't expect both Narcissa and Bellatrix's marriages to be so troubled. Well, he dared to have a bastard outside of marriage, said Bella, her eyes half closed, lazily rubbing her face against his thighs. And what did you do when you found out? Asterion asked, curious. I killed both, the woman and the child in front of him. But he's too petty, hates me only for killing his pleasure sac and his immoral seed, Bellatrix replied with a sadistic and terrifying smile on her lips, although her face maintained an innocent expression. Asterion remained stoic in the face of the shocking revelation. Not that he was indifferent to the death of a child, but it was like hearing news of someone's death on the other side of the continent, irrelevant to his life. He shook his head and said calmly, and you still claim he has no reason to want to kill you. It doesn't matter. He will die by my hands in the end. After all, he's weak and incompetent, Bella replied indifferently. Killing the woman and the child was trivial to her. As for Rodolphus's hatred, she didn't care. In fact, she wanted him to hate her even more. Seeing the desperation in his eyes when he was about to die would be a delicious scene to witness. Asterion just rolled his eyes and then lifted her face with his index finger. He brought her face dangerously close to hers, causing her bodies to come closer and her breasts to press against his chest. What a naughty girl you are, Bellatrix, he whispered in her ear. His whisper was like that of a demon trying to seduce one into sin. Bellatrix's pale cheeks acquired a rosy hue of shyness. Asterion found amusement in her reaction. The killing and torturing machine in front of him seemed like a timid girl. For some reason, this brought him a sense of satisfaction. His finger slid over the soft skin of her cheek, down to her chin, and stopped at her lips, where he traced his thumb over her plump, red lips. The lipstick smeared and spread to the sides. Bellatrix's green eyes were clouded with raw desire as she sucked his finger as if savoring the most delicious delicacy in the world. But when she was ready to strip off all her clothes and surrender to pleasure in a carnal night of passion and wild sex, her master pulled back with a teasing laugh. Asterion finally felt satisfied with his revenge. He had spent weeks being seduced in various ways by this woman, but this time, he made her feel her own poison. "I just remembered I have an appointment, perhaps later, Bella," said Asterion, rising and ignoring Bellatrix's hurt gaze. "Don't be so cruel, master." "My body is burning," Bellatrix said, writhing seductively, her cheeks flushing deeper. "Furthermore, as your master, I forbid you to touch yourself," Asterion said, showing a smile behind his equally sadistic mask, causing Bellatrix to widen her eyes in shock. Without waiting for a response, he left the room with light and agile steps. "The master is so cruel, I want him to tie me up and beat me. Should I call him daddy?" Breathing heavily, she murmured to herself with a sensual look. Leaving the room, Asterion noticed the house elves tidying up the last details for the ball, moving swiftly and completing all tasks efficiently. "Good work," praised Asterion, and the house elves seemed to receive the praise as if it were the most beautiful of praises. They instantly bowed and redoubled their efforts, performing tasks even more quickly, as if they were even more motivated. Watching the scene, Asterion merely shook his head, understanding why house elves had a low status in society. They fed off the magic of their masters, essentially becoming magical parasites and, as such, were undervalued, even more so than goblins. Continuing down the hallway, he found his great-grandfather standing in front of a huge painting, staring at it without blinking. As he approached, Asterion saw the painting of a tall man standing with his hand on the shoulder of a woman seated in a chair. Through the facial features, he recognized the man as Arcturus, and the woman, obviously, was his great-grandmother Melania Macmillan. "Did you love her?" Asterion asked, observing the elegant woman with black hair and blue eyes, sitting with her hands on her thighs and a slight smile on her lips. "Yes, more than anything. She was my beacon, illuminating my dirty and tarnished soul," his great-grandfather replied with a slightly hoarse voice, after a brief silence. He then turned to Asterion and continued, "I hope you find someone like that, Asterion. This is a lonely and cold world, especially for someone who will be at the top of the world like you, and the top is lonely." Each word seemed to be etched into Asterion's heart. The boy who turned 10 today merely remained silent, gazing at the painting of his great-grandmother. Taking a silver watch out of his pocket, Arcturus glanced at the time marked on the watch and said, "It's almost time, let's greet our guests." Arcturus then donned the mask on his face and walked towards the mansion's ballroom. His mask was plain black with gold details, a rather discreet yet elegant mask. "Bellatrix and Sirius?" Walking alongside him, Asterion asked. "Don't worry about that, as long as they're both wearing masks, no one will recognize them, and even if they do, no one would say anything. Everyone in that room is our ally and needs the Black family to survive in the face of the most powerful wizard in the world, Albus Dumbledore," Arcturus said, stopping in front of huge doors. "Or they just need to betray our house and turn to Dumbledore's side," Asterion said, looking at Arcturus with a cold stare. He would never trust a stranger, although it might seem somewhat paranoid, it was something he truly believed in. Always expect the worst from those you don't know. Perhaps that's why betrayal from someone dear is more painful. Then, kill the traitors and set an example of the expected fate for traitors. Arcturus looked directly into Asterion's eyes and spoke each word with a coldness capable of freezing a desert. Asterion nodded, showing a pensive look. If dialogue didn't resolve the issue, old ways always could. "Ready?" Arcturus asked. "Yes," Asterion simply nodded. Without hesitation, Arcturus opened the huge doors, revealing a magnificent ballroom made of black marble. Chandeliers illuminated the space with their soft light while hundreds of men and women conversed in low voices. In the air, without any visible musical instruments, classical music played, creating a comfortable and cozy atmosphere. The guests, upon hearing the doors opening, suddenly fell silent, looking at the two figures who had just entered, one tall and the other short. The hosts of the party had just arrived. Chapter 33 Masquerade Ball 2. Observing the men and women in the ballroom, Asterion was dazzled by the profusion of elegant suits and dresses. The women paraded in stunning dresses, richly adorned with jewels and threads of gold and silver, while the men showcased themselves in expensive and extravagant suits. Everyone wore masks that covered half of their faces, adding an air of mystery and elegance to the slightly dimmer environment. The Gothic classical music echoed in the hall, without the visible presence of any instruments, as if the sound emerged from the air itself. Arcturus picked up 2 champagne glasses that floated gently in the air, keeping one for himself and offering the other to Asterion. A solemn silence filled the ballroom as everyone awaited his words. "It is with great honor that I welcome all of you on this special day," Arcturus began, his voice resonating with authority and a rare touch of warmth. "Today marks the entrance of a young wizard into our noble society. Someone who will be engraved in the history of magic." He paused, his gaze sweeping across all present before continuing. "May this be a moment of celebration and welcome for our dear Asterion Black Slytherin." With that said, Arcturus raised his glass to his lips and everyone followed suit, toasting along with him, including Asterion himself. Immediately after the toast, a round of applause echoed through the hall, filling it with an atmosphere of warmth and approval. However, despite his great-grandfather's warm gesture, Asterion couldn't help but feel embarrassed by the praise. The flowery expressions from his great-grandfather truly left him feeling ashamed. "It's time for you to greet our guests." "I'll be busy chatting with some acquaintances," Arcturus whispered to Asterion as the applause subsided, gesturing for others to do the same. Asterion took a deep breath and nodded, resigned to the task at hand. He didn't particularly enjoy social interaction, preferring the company of a good book to the falseness of high society smiles. However, he recognized the importance of learning to socialize, especially given his position as the heir of the 2 most prominent houses. With an elegant posture, the young heir moved towards the crowd, greeting each person who approached to meet him. Asterion didn't have an exact notion of the number of people who greeted him, but they were certainly in the hundreds, all occupying prominent positions in society. Most were lords of their respective houses, while others were powerful magnates, whose coffers overflowed with gold. Each person who greeted him treated him with reverent respect, as if he were a true prince. However, behind the exaggerated and beautiful compliments, Asterion detected a touch of falseness and reverence. He wondered if that respect was due to the prestige of his lineage as a Black Slytherin, or if it was simply a deference to the future power he represented as a special grade wizard. But Asterion chose not to reject these people, as he was equally false in his greetings and conversations. He didn't consider himself hypocritical to that extent. Suddenly, while greeting one of the lords from one of the Russian houses, the music in the air changed rhythm, shifting from a brisk cadence to a slow and enveloping melody. It was clearly a signal for couples to dance in the center of the ballroom, and everyone consciously made space. Apologizing to the Russian lord, whose wealth was evident in his attire, Asterion approached the first lady he encountered, of similar age to his, and with a graceful bow, courteously asked, "Milady, would it be an honor for me to have the opportunity to dance with you?" "The honor would be mine, young sir," replied the girl, her voice cool and melodious. Asterion extended his hand, and the girl took it with a delicate and gentle touch. Walking to the center of the ballroom, he faced her and wrapped his arm around her waist with a gentle and reserved grip. She, in turn, placed her hand on his shoulder. To the melody of the music, they danced a waltz with an awkward yet elegant slowness. "You're not accustomed to dancing, Heir Black," she said, moving gracefully to the music, her blue eyes meeting Asterion's red eyes with striking intensity. Asterion wasn't surprised by her ability to discern his identity. After all, his eyes, even in the dim light, were remarkably distinct. He looked into the noble blue eyes behind the white swan mask and replied sincerely, "Dancing isn't one of my talents, especially considering this is my first dance." The girl fell silent, staring at him, before leaning slightly back, exposing her slender neck. The grip around her waist intensified, preventing her from falling completely, and she moved back towards him. To be honest, I thought you'd be different from what I've heard from the rumors circulating through the country, she said, drawing closer to his face. Courtesy of Rita Skeeter, I presume, Asterion replied with a near laugh at her words. He made a point to read every morning what that woman wrote about him, and he never tired of the countless conspiracy theories she could imagine. You know? She asked, slightly surprised, leaning forward to hear his words better. I feel a strange fascination reading what that woman writes about me. She's only alive because I stopped my grandfather from killing her. The woman really managed to irritate him, explained Asterion, with a tone of admiration mixed with perplexity. My father also mentioned how annoying that woman can be, the girl agreed, nodding along with his words. As they continued to dance, their conversations unfolded in whispers, an intimate exchange of words. Over time, the dance flowed with more grace and elegance, reflecting the growing harmony between them. Asterion felt comfortable talking to the girl. Perhaps it was because of their similar age, or maybe it was because she didn't treat him like a child. Although he displayed maturity, Arcturus and Narcissa always treated him with a certain condescension, like an adult speaking to a child. Which was especially irritating. Time passed, and finally, the music came to an end, at least for its first part. Parting ways, Asterion elegantly bowed as he said, "It was an honor, my lady." She held the edges of her dress and inclined with equal elegance, replying, "The honor was mine, Heir Black. I hope you have a wonderful birthday." After saying this, she turned and walked away without looking back, disappearing among the hundreds of people. Asterion merely watched her back for a moment before continuing on his own path. He didn't ask for her name, as there was no need. They wouldn't see each other again, it was just a dance that he would cherish fondly in his memory. Huh? Asterion looked confusedly to the side as Baskerville alerted him that something harmless had landed on him. Glancing down discreetly, he found a ladybug at the edge of his jacket. Ladybug? How did a ladybug get in here? Wait, ladybug. Asterion remembered that Rita Skeeter's animagus form was a ladybug. Honestly, he admired the woman for her audacity and courage to infiltrate the Black Mansion. Before the ball, a breach was opened in the barrier protecting the mansion to allow the guests to enter. The woman probably sneaked in with one of the guests or was intentionally brought inside. Asterion decided not to act immediately, choosing to play with the woman for now. Climbing the stairs to the first floor of the ballroom, he found himself facing a beautiful view of the mansion's garden, holding a glass of champagne. Taking a sip of champagne, he savored the cold night breeze. Suddenly, he noticed a woman approaching from behind. As he brought the glass to his lips, he watched the woman draw near. She appeared to be around 40 years old, with black hair showing a few strands of white, elegantly arranged in a bun. She possessed a decent beauty, at least from what he could discern. The brown eyes behind the feathered mask seemed particularly shrewd. Heir Black, greeted the woman, raising her own champagne glass as she sported a slightly arrogant smile on lips adorned with lipstick. Asterion remained silent, observing the woman as he finished the contents of his glass. It was evident that this woman was different from the other guests who had greeted him earlier. While they treated him with respect, she, on the other hand, spoke to him as if they were equals, a rather rude attitude considering they were in his house. The woman didn't seem bothered by Asterion's silence and continued to smile, taking out a business card from her small purse. Curious, Asterion took the card and read, R. There was only one letter on the business card and nothing more. He looked at the woman with confusion, waiting for an explanation. Heir Black, we are an organization of scholars, researchers, inventors, and explorers, said the woman with a mysterious tone, leaving a series of possibilities and evocative images hanging in the air. Asterion wasn't particularly interested, it was obviously a suspicious organization, one he definitely didn't want to get involved with. Seeing that Asterion didn't seem interested, the woman wasn't disappointed. She spoke as she headed for the exit. If you wish to know more, there's a method to reach me on the back of the card. After speaking, she left, leaving Asterion staring at the business card with a slightly intrigued look. If I were a normal teenager, maybe I would have fallen for this cheap trick of deception. Unfortunately for you, I'm not a normal teenager, Asterion murmured to himself as the business card began to combust. Only a fool would enter such a suspicious organization, especially with such a childish trick the woman used to pique interest in the organization she was a part of. Perhaps a naive boy curious about the nature of secret organizations as depicted in history books would fall for this cheap trick. Tossing the still-burning business card into the air, he left the balcony with a smile on his lips. This party was proving to be more interesting than he had expected. As they arrived beside Arcturus, Asterion was about to speak when his body stiffened, the hairs on his arms standing on end as he felt the colossal magical energy at the entrance of the mansion. Although it was still blocked by the barrier, the aura was suffocating, resembling a miniature sun. Only the presence of that aura could exorcise cursed spirits of grade 4 and 3. He wasn't the only one who felt it, as all the grade 1 witches and wizards present looked towards the entrance with solemn faces. Arcturus couldn't help but murmur, "Special grade wizard." Asterion, standing beside him, widened his eyes in surprise. Arcturus didn't bother to respond and opened a breach in the barrier, allowing the entry of the mysterious wizard. "Go greet our unexpected guests," Arcturus said solemnly, looking at Asterion. This wasn't Albus Dumbledore's aura, he knew it well, so he knew it wasn't the man's. But since the mysterious man didn't conceal his aura, he wasn't apparently an enemy at first sight. Thus, he gave Asterion the task of greeting the mystery guest as a lesson. Asterion nodded and headed towards the entrance of the ballroom. It took about 5 minutes for the guests to arrive at the ballroom with the help of the house elf from the House of Black, Monstro. As the doors opened, Asterion almost instantly focused on the elderly-looking man in the center, surrounded by 10 people. They all had a crest on their chest, to be more precise, a strange symbol that he recognized as the Deathly Hallows. Some party guests recognized the crest and paled. The elderly man was dressed in a very common black German suit. He looked like a gentle and warm grandfather with his smile and kind silver eyes resembling moons in the night sky. He held a wrapped gift in his hands as he approached Asterion. "Hello, young Asterion, I apologize for my late and unannounced arrival, but I had urgent pending matters. This is a gift for you," he said, looking directly at Asterion with a gaze that seemed capable of seeing into someone's soul. "Thank you, sir." Holding the gift, Asterion asked cautiously. "Gellert Grindelwald," he replied, with a friendly smile on his lips. Chapter 34 Masquerade Ball 3. Sighs of surprise echoed through the crowd of guests. They certainly hadn't expected to see the legendary Gellert Grindelwald appearing at the Black Heir's birthday party. It wasn't just them who were surprised, Asterion was too, but he looked calmly at the man who ruled Europe with an iron fist. Grindelwald dared to preach his ideals openly, and all the magical ministries of European countries dared not to act. No one wanted a walking atomic bomb full of rage in their country. So, they turned a blind eye to the man's deeds, counting on him not to dare do anything too serious. The European countries didn't care about what he did. Placing his hand over his chest, Asterion leaned forward and gestured gracefully. "Welcome, Lord Grindelwald. I hope the party suits your liking." "What a polite young man. Unfortunately I had no grandchildren or children," Gellert commented with a regretful tone at the end. Asterion almost rolled his eyes at the man's words, but the idea of Dumbledore being a man and still able to be pregnant was certainly a funny sight. "Although your former lover might think otherwise," Asterion remarked, looking at the man with an indifferent gaze. As he said this, he felt Grindelwald's gaze turn slightly cold, but the feeling lasted only for a brief moment. If he weren't as sensitive as he was, he would have thought it was just an illusion. Grindelwald let out a low, charismatic laugh. "You seem to know a few things, young Asterion," he said, his eyes gleaming unusually. Asterion felt a shiver run through his body in the presence of those phosphorescent blue eyes. He knew what the man was doing, seeing the future. For a moment, Asterion wanted to kill the man here and now. If Grindelwald knew his plans, it would be a complete disaster. Unfortunately, he couldn't kill the man, he was too strong. For a moment, he felt what Dumbledore felt when he fought against Grindelwald, a seer. The feeling of helplessness, knowing that no matter what he did, the opponent would know and retaliate in an unpredictable manner, was truly unsettling. Ha 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 ha. Suddenly, Grindelwald laughed, releasing a loud burst of laughter that echoed in the particularly silent hall at that moment. A few moments later, he stopped and smiled gently at Asterion, his eyes reflecting the boy's appearance as if he saw something extraordinary. Young Asterion, you will certainly achieve great things. I eagerly await the day you reach that step, Grindelwald spoke, relaxed and cheerful at that moment, his joyful voice spreading throughout the hall, causing everyone to widen their eyes. Gellert Grindelwald had just praised the Black Heir. Some could imagine the repercussions of this act if it were leaked. Fortunately, everyone present was somehow connected to the House of Black and did not leak the information. Looking at the ladybug on his coat, Asterion pursed his lips, almost laughing, but finally restrained himself and managed not to smile. He would let the woman leave unnoticed, as the revelation of the news was of interest to him. Chaos had always been a ladder that few would climb, but he dared, regardless of how dangerous and risky things would become. I will accompany you, Lord Grindelwald, Asterion spoke with an indifferent gaze, gesturing elegantly. That would be kind of you, young Asterion, Grindelwald laughed and walked over to Arcturus first. After all, he was the host of the party. Observing the boy greet one of the most dangerous men in the world, if not the most dangerous, Daphne felt her heart beat faster with nervousness. Thanks to the Greengrass House's innate technique, Heart of Nature, she could feel the colossal amount of magical energy emanating from Gellert Grindelwald. The man was like a sun, radiating warmth and making the air thinner with his mere presence. What's wrong, sister? Worried about your future husband? Beside Daphne, a younger girl asked playfully, her fragile and gentle voice bringing the air of the Greengrass House back to her calm and indifferent demeanor. Humph. Seems like you've gotten bolder while I've been away, Astoria. Daphne looked at her younger sister and pinched her cheeks mercilessly. I was just kidding, no need to be so serious, Astoria, who had escaped her sister's clutches, complained to herself, while at the same time giving Daphne a teasing glance. And what about your future husband? I've seen his pictures, he looks very handsome. Perhaps too handsome, that could be a problem at Hogwarts. Daphne couldn't help but feel helpless as she remembered her future husband's appearance. She felt like her life would be difficult, especially at Hogwarts, where he would be surrounded by hormone-filled girls determined to win over her lovely husband. Daphne was especially worried about the girls from Slytherin. She could easily imagine how many orders these girls had received from their parents to seduce the Black Heir. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie, and that pie was Asterion Black, heir of the Black House and the Slytherin House. Please don't be so sad. Hearing her sister's helpless words, 8-year-old Astoria rolled her eyes at her hypocrisy. Although Daphne appeared very distressed, Astoria knew her sister was secretly enchanted and very pleased with her future husband. After all, she knew her sister had always dreamed of marrying a handsome, cold, and arrogant prince from Slytherin, but she didn't expect that dream to come true so perfectly as she wished. Not only a Black, but also a direct descendant of magical royalty, the Slytherin house. Looks like you're envious, sister, Daphne teased without hesitation. Yes, I am envious. You're marrying a prince, and I'm marrying a golden cat trying to pass itself off as a powerful lion, Astoria replied, muttering and showing herself very dissatisfied with her future spouse. At their first meeting, she had almost punched that arrogant face that seemed so punchable. She just hoped Draco would improve as he grew up and became more mature, otherwise, she would prefer to marry someone else. Not that she didn't like an arrogant man. But arrogance based on one's father's prestige, as Draco proudly displayed, certainly wasn't attractive to her. Seeing the two daughters whispering together, the Greengrass couple simply shook their heads and turned their attention back to the party hosts and the most illustrious guest of the party. You have an incredible grandson, Arcturus, Grindelwald spoke, looking up at the man who was about 20 centimeters taller than him. They had met before, about 20 years ago, when Arcturus was on a joint mission with other countries in Europe. "I can say the same about your adopted son," replied Arcturus, turning his gaze to the young man with medium-length black hair who always faithfully followed Grindelwald. The other acolytes were forming a formation about 10 meters away from the Dark Lord. Grindelwald nodded and spoke slowly, "Don't praise him too much, he might get arrogant." "Adopted son?" Asterion looked at the young man with curiosity. He appeared to be around 25 years old, but a wizard's appearance often deceived, so Asterion assumed he was much older than he appeared. Noticing the confusion on Asterion's face, Grindelwald introduced him, placing his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Aurelius Dumbledore, my adopted son." If Grindelwald's arrival shocked the audience, then Aurelius's identity left everyone speechless, not understanding what was happening at the moment. Asterion looked at the young man, surprised. After all, that was the surname of the most powerful wizard in the world, Albus Dumbledore. He couldn't recall if he had read about this character in the books or seen him in the movies, but he thought it might be from the new films he hadn't watched due to lack of time. "Hello, Aurelius." Approaching him, Asterion greeted him as he should as one of the hosts. "Black air." After a brief silence, he replied, looking at Asterion with his black eyes. A short and cold response, without any sign of wanting to initiate a conversation, something Asterion could probably understand. Conversing with people was tiresome. But, observing Aurelius, Asterion couldn't help but be surprised. There was something strange about Aurelius Dumbledore. In his senses, it was as if his magical energy moved on its own, as if it were alive. However, that was impossible. Magical energy was just that, energy without consciousness. It was like a program with complex and infinite orders, created by the natural order of things, but without intelligence. But in Aurelius's case, it was as if it were alive and had become a separate entity from the host, two souls in one body. That was the most accurate answer to his confusion. Another thing that intrigued him was that his magical energy was actually negative magical energy. This puzzled him. Was Aurelius human or a cursed spirit, perhaps a hybrid? If that were the case, could cursed spirits reproduce sexually, or was it another process? There was also the option that Grindelwald had created him artificially, but he had no idea how. In Asterion's mind, the idea of capturing Aurelius and dissecting him while still alive on the surgical table appeared, but it was suppressed the moment it emerged. Aurelius was a semi-special grade wizard, and he always stayed by Grindelwald's side, making it impossible to kidnap him without anyone knowing. Aurelius, who was looking at Asterion, couldn't help but take a few steps back. For some reason, the eyes of the boy in front of him were particularly frightening. He looked at him as if he saw a rare and extinct specimen. Seeing this, Asterion, realizing he had exhibited inappropriate behavior, cleared his throat, feeling somewhat embarrassed, and offered a polite smile. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask, I would be here to help with anything." Aurelius nodded and returned to stand behind Grindelwald while cautiously eyeing the boy who emitted dangerous emotions. Asterion didn't insist on speaking with Aurelius and walked among the guests, greeting everyone and asking if they were enjoying the party when suddenly, he overheard the conversation of three men in the background. "Have you heard the rumors? 5 squads of Aurors have disappeared in pursuit of Bellatrix Lestrange and Sirius Black. They've been missing for over 3 weeks and still haven't been found. The families are still searching for the missing ones, but nothing so far, as if they've vanished from the world. Word has it that Rufus was furious about the incident and personally went to find his missing men." Asterion, who was listening to everything, pondered deeply. According to Bellatrix, she had evaded the Aurors by using a cursed spirit capable of simulating aura and someone's appearance, but was that really the case? "You weren't invited, Lucius," Narcissa said, her voice especially cold, as she looked at her husband through a golden mask. "Still upset, Narcissa?" Lucius, the patriarch of the Malfoy family, took a sip of champagne and spoke with disinterest. "Upset? Don't make me laugh. If I were upset about something, you'd be dead, and I'd make sure it was very painful." Narcissa's eyes couldn't help but grow even colder. His carefree attitude made her particularly irritated. I don't understand your anger, they're just a few mistresses, I'm not stopping you from having your toys if you want. Lucius looked at his wife, and noticing her cold and deadly gaze, he wasn't afraid and finished his champagne glass. Lucius's words were the last straw for her. She laughed coldly and spoke with such a deadly look that it sent a shiver down everyone's spine. Fine, first you call me petty for not allowing you to cheat on me, now you call me a slut. Do you really think I'm someone who takes everything silently? With her words, she took off the wedding ring on her ring finger and threw it into Lucius's champagne glass as she turned away, but before leaving, she left her words behind. You're lucky this is Asterion's birthday, otherwise, would announce to everyone here that I'm divorcing the trash that is you. Looking at the wedding ring in his glass, Lucius smirked and muttered to himself, Narcissa, you think you're so amazing and noble, but you're nothing but an emotionless doll. You're doing me a favor by divorcing me, at least the blame will fall on you, of that I'm sure. As the party came to an end, Asterion and Arcturus stood side by side, each holding a champagne glass, observing the hundreds of guests awaiting their next words. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for sharing this moment with me. It's a special memory that I will cherish. At the same time, I want to express my gratitude to Narcissa, my dear cousin, who organized this entire ceremony with nothing less than perfection, began Asterion, addressing the crowd who listened to him in silence. He continued with his speech, lastly, I toast to all of us, to happiness, to health, and to success. May we face the challenges that the future holds for us with courage and determination. Thank you again to everyone, and may tonight continue to be an unforgettable celebration, as it is for me. Watching Asterion speak softly in front of hundreds of people, Arcturus nodded satisfactorily. In comparison to when the ball began, the boy had made great progress. When Asterion finished speaking, a barrage of applause echoed in the hall, everyone clapping as they looked at the small figure raising the champagne glass. Grindelwald clapped slowly as his smile grew, almost reaching the edges of his face. A terrifying and exhilarated smile. I hope you grow up quickly, Asterion. I'm really looking forward to when you take the true stage, murmured the Dark Lord, his gaze focused on the boy who would either bring about the world's destruction or save it, depending on how cruel fate would be. Chapter 35 3 years later. August 25, 1993 England, Lancashire County, City of Lancaster. Boom! A loud explosion erupted from a school on the outskirts of Lancaster, reducing the historic education building to mere rubble, with a cloud of dust spreading in all directions. Beastly roar! From the dust cloud emerged a huge green creature roaring towards the skies, a massive, flabby humanoid. Its enormous mouth, capable of swallowing entire buildings, dripped venom and acid onto the ground, melting it into craters, rendering the soil infertile for any life to thrive. On the other side, emerged from the dust cloud, a figure gliding skillfully through the air. He was a young man of about 16 years old, standing at 174 centimeters tall, clad in black armor with a crown floating above his head. The entire armor bore eerie red eyes, which seemed alive as they blinked and closed at a slow pace. The crown floating above his head mirrored the same eerie appearance of the armor. Looking at the destroyed school, Asterion knew the government would have difficulties explaining why a perfectly intact school had disappeared completely. Fortunately, he had used a curtain before the battle. But it wasn't time to dwell on that, and Asterion focused on the cursed spirit of special grade, particularly the cursed spirit wasn't too strong for him, a special grade wizard, but the innate technique of the cursed spirit was especially annoying. Acid and poison. With the simplistic mind of the cursed spirit, it wielded its innate technique as nothing more than a simple mist. The mist was capable of poisoning and corroding everything it touched, rendering the land around the school uninhabitable, at least for a few months. But that was it, just irritating. It would be easier if it used spells, but considering the disaster it would be if it cast a spell, he refrained from using his own spells, especially without the wand to control the spell's accuracy. At times, Asterion wished that casting spells was as easy as using his innate technique, but it wasn't the case, especially for him, who had a colossal magical energy that was mostly uncontrollable. Floating in the air, he makes a seal with both hands. Asterion summoned a massive cloud of darkness in the dark sky within the curtain. From it emerged a colossal silver serpent, its colossal size seeming to cover the entire school grounds, with silver scales adorned with symbols resembling pupilless eyes. Ouroboros. Looking at his cursed spirit possessing an innate technique related to fate, Asterion glanced coldly at the humanoid cursed spirit still roaring towards him. The cursed spirit didn't attack him, it seemed it could sense the mortal danger he was feeling at the moment. Which wasn't surprising, given that high-grade cursed spirits were capable of speaking and thinking like humans and other intelligent races. But the fear was short-lived, as the cursed spirit opened its mouth and released a huge cloud of venom and acid, covering the entire area within the curtain that separated the inner realm from the real world. However, something incredible happened. The silver serpent in the sky bit its own tail. In the next moment, the entire cloud of venom and acid seemed to rewind in time. Even the cursed spirit appeared confused, but his confusion lasted only a second before he let out a furious roar. Every time he moved, he returned to the same spot he was in, as if trapped in an eternal loop. Seeing the huge, furious spirit finally trapped, Asterion was pleased with Ouroboros' ability. The serpent was one of his trump cards to use against the bearer of the 6 eyes, and seeing the results of his creation, he was very satisfied. Now, let's play, as I really need to unwind, Asterion murmured to himself as he fell from the sky towards the cursed spirit. As he descended, a pair of black gauntlets appeared in his hands. Upon landing on the cursed spirit's head, Asterion closed his fist and gathered magical energy before delivering the punch. Boom! The entire head of the cursed spirit deformed, green blood splattered onto Asterion's face. He didn't stop and continued delivering another punch, even stronger and charged with magical energy, exploding the cursed spirit's head this time, silencing the creature's roar. A large amount of putrid green blood splattered hundreds of meters around. Not waiting for the cursed spirit to regenerate, Asterion reached out and used his innate technique creation and manipulation of cursed spirits to control it. A huge sphere of blue magical energy appeared around the gigantic cursed spirit, slowly melting it until it transformed into a blue sphere in Asterion's hand. This is the 5th special grade cursed spirit I've exorcised. With this one, I've completed the Ministry of Magic's evaluation. I'm officially the 2nd special grade wizard in England and 32nd in the known world today. Looking at the blue orb in his hand, Asterion curved his lips into a smile and swallowed the cursed orb without hesitation. Along with this one, Asterion had about 15 special grade cursed spirits, 5 exorcised and 10 created over 3 years of insane training, during which he just wanted a bit of vacation before continuing his infernal journey. With this mission completed, Asterion could finally return home after 3 months of absence. But hunting down 5 cursed spirits took longer than he expected, especially with these beings able to change their own negative magical energy, making their exact location difficult, camouflaging themselves with a lower grade than they truly were. But these 3 months were not in vain, they brought him a tremendous increase in strength, as he created and captured so many cursed spirits, which was considered quite satisfying. Closing the curtain, the sky gradually returned to its beautiful celestial blue, but the destruction of the school building remained unchanged. But there was nothing Asterion could do. It was better for the school's destruction than the entire city, which could happen if the cursed spirit left its place of origin. It wasn't common for this to happen, but unfortunately, it wasn't an absolute rule. In his 4th exorcism, unfortunately, this happened. He arrived late, and a significant part of a city in Gloucestershire had been destroyed. The government had told the people that the cause was a large accidental explosion, but Asterion knew that a cursed spirit had left its place of origin and caused more than 20,000 casualties before being exorcised by him. When the veil was lifted, Asterion saw that the entire school area had been cordoned off with several yellow and red perimeter tapes. Behind the tapes, several government cars were parked, each bearing a logo of a sword and shield crossed with an acronym below. Me-Zero. It was the secret government organization responsible for bridging the wizarding world and the normal world. It had the authority to evacuate an entire city if necessary. I presume that since we're alive, the cursed spirit has been exorcised. Asterion looked at the middle-aged man in a suit and nodded, signaling that he was correct. The man took out his cell phone and spoke, "The special grade cursed spirit has been successfully exorcised." After reporting, he pocketed the phone and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it as he looked at the young man with a complex expression. He had worked for over 20 years in MI0, but he never got used to seeing children fighting these monsters. To him, these children should be in schools playing and hanging out with friends, not fighting to the death against these abominations. Unfortunately, the world didn't work as he wanted. "Good job, Agent Black," he said, blowing a smoke ring from his mouth. "Thank you as well for your hard work, Agent Grey," Asterion also sincerely thanked. In these 3 months, he had seen how hard these people worked to make the world a little better, enough for normal people to live their lives normally. Edward Grey simply nodded and replied, "It's the least we can do while you're risking your life, Agent Black." He continued speaking, this time with a sincere smile, "By the way, congratulations on becoming the second special grade wizard in England." "Yes, but I'm not as happy as I thought I would be," Asterion said, looking at the tired man in front of him, sighing while maintaining a surprisingly cold gaze. He was remembering the tragedy that had occurred 3 weeks ago. Seeing over 20,000 bodies was truly a hellish sight that he never wanted to witness a second time. Edward also sighed. He was on the case when the special grade cursed spirit had escaped from its place of origin. Even after working in this world for 20 years, he probably never forgot that infernal scene. Flicking the cigarette ashes away, Edward spoke to Asterion with a serious look. "The occurrences of cursed spirits are increasing, almost 50% more than last year, and they're still rising." Asterion remained silent, obviously aware of this. It wasn't just happening in England, all countries were suffering similarly, and the existence of the supernatural was on the brink of being exposed at any moment. This world was heading towards an end worthy of an apocalyptic scenario. "I just hope God helps us." Edward showed a helpless look on his face and spoke, looking up at the sky, apparently hoping for some divine salvation. Unfortunately, God had given humans free will, he had left the fate of humanity to be decided by itself. Asterion shook his head and bid farewell to the veteran agent, leaving with a cold and indifferent look on his face. "God will help, whether we want it or not," he muttered to himself. Chapter 36 3 years, 2. Entering the Black Mansion, Asterion only saw a shadow flying towards him. In the next second, he felt an extremely tight embrace around him. Looking at the woman clinging to him, he showed a helpless expression and stroked her back. "Missed you too, Bella." "Master, I missed you so much. Let's kill some people to relax." Clinging to her master's body, Bellatrix looked at Asterion's face and showed a look full of anticipation. Her green eyes seemed to shine with the idea of killing. "Tempting, but I'll have to decline for now." "Get off me." Shaking his head, Asterion declined and lightly tapped Bella's buttocks, signaling for her to get off him. Bellatrix looked disappointed and pouted her lips as she gazed at Asterion with a hurt expression. Nonetheless, she released him, though she remained holding onto his arm. Observing the 40-year-old woman behaving like a 12-year-old girl, Asterion let out a resigned sigh and walked to the living room with Bellatrix still clinging tightly to his arm. Entering the living room, he soon saw the old Black Patriarch. The man was 93 years old and still looked majestic. He was sitting in an armchair reading his newspaper. Next to him, there was a steaming cup of tea waiting to be sipped at any moment. Noticing his arrival, the man opened a smile, folded the newspaper, and placed it on the table. "Welcome back, Asterion," he said, looking emotionally at the tall young man for his age. Unbeknownst to him, the boy who walked through the same doors 3 years ago had now turned into one of the most powerful men in the country. "Congratulations on becoming England's second special grade wizard," Arcturus said, even though he knew this would eventually come, he still felt incredibly pleased and proud. Now, he could leave this world peacefully knowing he had left behind a worthy heir. Seeing the two conversing without paying attention to her, Bellatrix spoke very discontentedly. "I'm here too, don't ignore me." "Bellatrix, you need to learn not to interrupt a conversation," Arcturus sighed and spoke in a tone full of helplessness. No one but him knows what he went through in those 3 months. Without Asterion to control her, Bellatrix practically became an uncontrollable madwoman. It wasn't once or twice that he found Bellatrix covered in blood with a sadistic smile on her face. Fortunately, the woman knew how to cover her tracks, otherwise, the Black Mansion would be a common destination for Aurors to visit. As for whom she killed and tortured, Arcturus was too lazy to ask. He was already old and didn't want to care about what Bellatrix did with her life. "Always so old-fashioned," Bellatrix muttered discontentedly, hearing Arcturus grumble, but upon seeing Asterion's cold expression, she remained silent. "I'll take a shower, we'll talk more at lunch," Asterion said, shaking his head at Bella's silence and addressing Arcturus. "Very well," Arcturus nodded and returned to reading his newspaper calmly. Midline horizontal ellipsis feeling the warm water enveloping his body, Asterion let out a comfortable sigh. He rested his head against the bathtub and gazed silently at the bathroom ceiling. Not only did he not feel tired, but it had been 6 months since he'd felt any fatigue at all. It had been half a year since he possessed the magical energy necessary to be considered a special grade wizard, which was 100 times the energy of a grade 1. To put it into perspective, he felt like he could summon Nidhogg the size of the city of London, essentially destroying it in the process. He understood perfectly why special grade wizards were considered weapons of mass destruction, each one possessed an amount of energy capable of rivaling that of an atomic bomb. Asterion didn't know how much magical energy he currently possessed, but it was still growing, showing no signs of stopping anytime soon. This meant he hadn't reached his peak yet. Raising his hand, Asterion created an oval barrier above it. If one were to look inside the dark barrier, they would see a completely different scenery from the world outside, as if it were a different world altogether. It was the ultimate technique one could achieve using their inborn technique. Domain expansion. Domain expansion was achieved by expanding the inborn domain with magical energy while using a barrier to construct it within a separate space. The caster then infused their inborn technique into the barrier to complete the expansion, allowing them to deploy their ability throughout the domain. From the outside, the barrier of a normal domain is usually fully enclosed, making it appear as a floating black sphere that can even be moved slightly if needed. Honestly, it wasn't difficult if you had enough magical energy. For example, Asterion could use it when he was still a semi-special grade wizard. Using his domain expansion without a barrier, like Sukuna, proved to be a difficult challenge to accomplish. No matter how hard he tried, it seemed impossible to manifest his domain without a barrier. Firstly, there was nothing to sustain the manifestation as support, even the air itself was unsuitable as it wasn't a conduit for magical energy, making the entire technique impossible. Asterion himself was doubting whether he could do something like that, perhaps he couldn't even accomplish it due to the worlds being different. Magical energy and cursed energy seemed similar, but they were very different, with the latter being much weaker than the former. After all, magical energy itself altered reality, making it possible to fully manifest the potential of the inborn technique. This means that if Gojo were born in this world, he wouldn't be OP like in the anime, he would be a god, capable of altering, manipulating, and controlling space as if it were a ball of paper. This was one of the reasons he was concerned about the bearer of the 6 eyes, it was a completely insane and broken ability. Fortunately, he could fight without fear against the other knowing that he wouldn't be beaten to death like other extras. Asterion never thought his inborn technique, creation and manipulation of cursed spirits, was inferior to limitless. While limitless could do anything with space, he could counterattack by creating something. But even without his inborn technique, he was confident in fighting using spells. Not that he could cast any at the moment, believe me, he tried a simple lighting spell and manifested a damn small sun that could be seen from the other side of the city if it weren't for the mansion's barrier. Since then, he refrained from using magic without the wand to control the power of the spells. Without the wand to control the power of the spells, all the spells he cast would be amplified to an insane level with the huge amount of magical energy he possessed. It might seem strange that he could perfectly use his inborn technique, but not spells. However, understand that one was like using his own hand. For example, you think, and it happens. His magic would automatically provide energy when needed, just like the body's energy, as natural as possible. Spells, on the other hand, required not only gestures but also focusing on the act and having the will to cast them, coupled with the large amount of magical energy he needed to control. This made things extremely difficult for someone without a wand to aid him. Arriving at the dining hall, appropriately dressed, Asterion found Arcturus, Bellatrix, and Narcissa waiting at the table. After the divorce 3 years ago, Narcissa moved back to the Black House and reclaimed her old surname with Arcturus' permission. As for Sirius, he had been missing for 3 years, disappearing shortly after his birthday. No one knew where he was, but whether it was Asterion or Arcturus, they had a vague idea of his whereabouts. Arcturus seemed indifferent to Sirius' departure, but Asterion knew that the old patriarch had suffered from his grandson's abrupt departure. After all, Sirius was his grandson, his son's son. Nevertheless, Sirius chose to be with his other family, the Potter House. Narcissa, noticing Asterion's arrival, stood up and hugged him while speaking. "Congratulations on officially becoming a special grade wizard, Asti." She gave him a gentle kiss on his cheek and looked at him with a proud gaze, like an older sister proud of her younger brother's accomplishments. "Thank you, Sissy," he replied, returning the hug kindly. "I think I'm going to vomit rainbows," Bellatrix muttered with the sweet scene unfolding before her. After the scene, everyone sat down and conversed while eating. "Ready for Hogwarts?" Cutting a piece of beef with his knife, Arcturus asked, putting the meat in his mouth with the fork. "Yes, I've personally ordered my custom wand from Lord Gregorovitch. It should be delivered one day before Hogwarts. As for other things, everything's ready, just need to pack," Asterion said, taking a sip of wine from his glass. He had kind of gotten a bit addicted to alcoholic beverages, although none could really make him drunk, they just served to satisfy his palate. "Entendido, acqui esta a verso revisada y traducida du texto." Knowing that Asterion was going to Hogwarts, Narcissa felt disheartened. He had just returned from a 3-month absence, and now he would be spending half the year at Hogwarts, although he could return during summer break and Christmas. But for her, who loved being by his side, it was a cruel torture. "Sissy, you should be worried, we don't know how many girls will want to suck him." Bellatrix, seeing her sister's despondent look, didn't hold back and said wickedly, causing everyone at the table to look at her with a helpless gaze. The image of Bellatrix's words appeared in Narcissa's mind, causing her to viciously stab the fork into the meat on her plate, resulting in a sound of something breaking. "I don't think that's going to happen, Bella. I'll be in a school for learning." Seeing things gradually slipping out of control, Asterion spoke calmly as he wiped the corner of his mouth with a napkin. "Do you know anything interesting about Hogwarts, Master? Because of the life-threatening missions, the stress at Hogwarts is quite high. Imagine 16-year-olds stressed with near-death experiences and full of hormones. Believe me when I say that the exaggerated number of broom closets at Hogwarts serves a very special purpose." Rowena Ravenclaw, as smart as ever, he. Bellatrix opened her mouth and put the piece of meat in it, then licked her lips sensually. Her green eyes provocatively glanced at Narcissa, who ate in silence. Bellatrix knew her sister. Narcissa had always been possessive since childhood. She never gave anything to theirs, everything that was hers and no one else's. Asterion was considered hers and no one else's. Even if she didn't love him romantically, he was hers. Bella felt a little pity for her master's future wife, but only for a moment. She would delight in watching the battle that would ensue between the future Lady Black and Narcissa Black. Perhaps noticing her eyes, Asterion gave her a stern look and continued eating in silence. Seeing things getting even more chaotic, Arcturus sighed and showed a bitter look in his black eyes. This house hadn't been quiet for long since everyone arrived. Bellatrix and Narcissa always fought over the smallest things, especially with Bellatrix knowing how to push all of Narcissa's buttons, leaving her angry at all times. "That's enough from both of you, eat your food in silence. You two look like two quarrelsome animals. Asterion, come to my office before going to bed." Tapping his fork on the table, Arcturus spoke in a grave and powerful tone, looking at his grandnieces. Narcissa glared furiously at Bellatrix, who only smiled, showing her impeccably white teeth as she played with the fork with her fingers. At night, Asterion stood beside Arcturus as they descended a spiral staircase of stones that delved deeper into the underground with each step. The path was illuminated by a lumos spell cast from the tip of Arcturus's wand. After descending for another 5 minutes, Asterion, who was becoming surprised by the depth they had reached, finally saw the end of the stairs, which led to a long corridor completely shrouded in darkness. Fortunately, Arcturus was still using lumos to illuminate the surroundings as they both silently walked through the long corridor made of stones that seemed particularly ancient. At the end of the corridor, Asterion was met by a metal door with a pentagram written in blood and runes that he didn't even recognize, but identified as ancient runes. "Make a cut on your hand and touch the pentagram." After gazing at the door for a moment, Arcturus turned to look at his great-grandson. Although surprised by the request, he obeyed the order and cut his hand with a dagger handed to him by Arcturus. With blood still dripping from the wound, he touched the door. As his blood made contact with the pentagram, it came to life, illuminating all the runes, and the sound of the door unlocking echoed instantly. Arcturus opened the door, and Asterion followed him, still confused by the entire situation. "Asterion, have you ever wondered what happens to the cursed spirits we exorcise in life when we finally die?" In an environment of stone illuminated by torches burning in red flames, Arcturus asked with a cold and indifferent voice. In the center of the stone room, a huge red pentagram, similar to the flickering flames around it, appeared especially malevolent, especially with the black coffin in the center of the pentagram. Asterion pondered before responding with an equally cold voice. "Yes, the conclusion I've reached is that they are released after our deaths. To prevent the chaos that would ensue every time a member of the House of Black died, our ancestor created the exorcism ritual, a ritual that used one's own blood to self-exorcise, burning away your soul, body, and mind." Arcturus looked at his great-grandson with appreciation in his eyes and answered, looking at the coffin that would be his final resting place. Asterion remained silent, knowing the final outcome of this conversation. "I am dying, Asterion. My body no longer responds as it should, my mind is foggy, and my senses are slow. I would say I have less than a year until my whole body becomes a leprous and mangy vessel, decaying with a putrid smell. But before that, I will take my own life." Asterion felt as if someone were crushing his heart. The man he respected and loved was about to depart, and he could do nothing but witness it all as an irrelevant spectator. Gently touching Asterion's hair, Arcturus spoke with a relaxed tone, full of relief. "I know what you're feeling right now, Asterion. I have lost loved ones, more than once, and this pain does not go away. Time does not dilute this bitterness and pain you feel at this moment, but you learn to live with it. I learned, and you will eventually learn too, because you are strong, because you are a Black. My only regret is not seeing you getting married and having children. A house full of kids running around is a beautiful sight." Looking into Asterion's eyes, Arcturus smiled and tousled his hair with a sad yet relieved expression. After a long silence, Asterion looked at his great-grandfather and asked, "Why were you telling me this?" "Because if I can't make it down here, you'll have to carry me and put my body in the coffin," Arcturus replied, looking at the coffin in the center of the pentagram. "You're cruel." Showing a sad and bitter smile, Asterion looked at Arcturus with resentment. The man was asking to be killed. "I know, but I know you'll do it," he finished as he walked out of the stone room, leaving Asterion with a grim and cold expression. Chapter 37 Hogwarts Express 1. Lying naked on the bed, Asterion pushed his hair back with his hand and looked at the naked woman beside him. She leaned her body against his, her breasts pressing against his chest. It was Bellatrix. After the conversation he had with his great-grandfather, Asterion only wanted one thing, to unwind. The most effective way to unwind, proven by the human race, was sex. One thing led to another and it happened, although it wasn't his first time. A year ago, he couldn't resist Bellatrix's seduction and indulged in the forbidden fruit. Asterion wasn't to blame, he wasn't made of iron, and his body was burning with adolescent hormones at that moment. Everywhere he looked, he saw the vague shape of beautiful buttocks. Damn, he looked at an apple and saw a butt. If you're wondering if he and Bellatrix had a romantic relationship, the answer was no. What they did was purely about sex and mutual pleasure, no one mentioned feelings. Master, you were so rough and wild, Bella looked at Asterion, leaving many kisses on his chest and neck. Her beautiful green eyes showed a lazy and satisfied look from the carnal night where they indulged in pleasure and hedonism. Seeing him still in silence, she asked, "Is something bothering you, master? How can I ease your worries?" Her face approached the curve of his neck, kissing and biting his neck while her hand gradually descended slowly to his lower region. "Take control, Bella." Enjoying the kisses and bites on his neck, Asterion relaxed into the pillow and spoke, closing his eyes. Bellatrix's eyes lit up upon hearing his words. She straddled Asterion and captured his lips without hesitation, nibbling and sucking on the sweet lips she never tired of kissing. Soon after, in the room, the sound of heavy sighs and hot moans echoed, along with the constant clapping sounds. The week passed quickly, and September 1st arrived, the day Hogwarts began its school year. Asterion was already packed and had a new wand in its holster tied to his arm. 24 centimeters, elder wood, and the core were as unusual as possible, a cursed spirit, to be precise, a core shaped like a cursed spirit made by himself. The core was nothing but pure negative magical energy, dark, sadistic, arrogant, and extremely fierce. When Asterion held the wand for the first time, a black glow bloomed from the tip. And a shockwave spread throughout the mansion, killing all the plant life in the mansion completely. His magic, once as untamed as a wild dragon, submitted to his wand without any hesitation. Now, he could cast spells without worrying about causing unnecessary destruction. The wand's appearance was entirely black, smooth as marble without any roughness. Intricately carved into the dark wood, a crow and a snake intertwined in a struggle. Honestly, he loved his customized wand, which was why he didn't go to Ollivander. The old British wand maker would refuse to use a wand so far outside his guidelines. Outside the mansion, Narcissa looked worriedly at Asterion, who held a suitcase in his hand. "Are you sure you don't want me to accompany you to the station?" "I'm not a child, sissy." Asterion rolled his eyes at her unfounded concern, but he didn't feel irritated by her excessive worry. After the divorce, she became especially attached to him, especially with her children not visiting her even once in 3 years. It could have been Lucius preventing the children from visiting, but it still hurt her. Suddenly, Narcissa hugged him and whispered many things in his ear, like sleeping early, not drinking too much, staying away especially from the Slytherin girls, and so on. She seemed more like a worried mother sending her child off to college. Pulling away from her, he looked at Bellatrix and said, "Don't forget my orders, Bella." "Yes, sir." Bella replied in a serious and loud tone, like a soldier saluting. "Send me a letter when needed." Looking at his great-grandfather, Asterion spoke with a softer tone than usual. Arcturus simply nodded and remained silent, looking at him with a calm and profound gaze. Saying goodbye to everyone once more, Asterion left, carrying his suitcase, and crossed the mansion's barrier. "He'll be fine, Narcissa. You don't need to worry so much," Arcturus said, comforting the woman as he noticed the concern on her face. "I know, but how can I not worry?" Narcissa murmured to herself with a sad look. Walking through King's Cross Station, Asterion easily located the secret entrance to platform 9 3/4. Before entering, he spotted a red-haired family wearing slightly worn clothes, hurrying along while engaged in conversation. The older red-haired woman didn't seem to stop talking, while the youngest girl, who appeared visibly frustrated, listened with a scowl on her face. Asterion almost instantly recognized the members of the Weasley family. In the original world they were the ones who benefited the most from the war, consequently producing the savior of the wizarding world and the smartest witch of the century. It could be said that the Weasley family was the Habsburg family of the magical world in terms of marriage. They lost some members in the war, yes, but gained other notable ones in the future. Shaking his head, Asterion ran towards the station pillar without fear, which, incidentally, was the entrance to platform 9 3/4. Asterion felt himself pass through a liquid barrier for a moment and found himself in another place. Many teenagers bustled back and forth while the Scarlet Express billowed steam across the platform. The place was chaotic and noisy, with cats darting around and owls hooting at each other. Asterion held onto his suitcase and stepped onto the crimson locomotive without a second thought, hating being in such a chaotic environment. Inside the train, Asterion saw numerous identical compartments, the only difference between them being the numbering beside each door. Walking for a moment and dodging some older students, Asterion chose an empty-looking compartment. To his surprise, when he opened the door, he found a young girl sitting by the window. "Is there a vacant spot, miss?" Narrowing his eyes, he inquired, looking at the young girl. "Yes, you can come in." Without looking at him, she replied casually, her voice lazy and slightly condescending. Asterion entered and placed his suitcase on the upholstered bench of the compartment. He sat down, glanced at the young girl, then looked away, taking a book from his suitcase and reading silently, not wanting to start a conversation. In the compartment, only the rustling of pages could be heard as both remained silent. Suddenly, breaking the silence, the door opened and a young girl with voluminous brown hair appeared. Her front teeth were slightly prominent, but the imperfection didn't detract from her charm. "May I come in?" she asked, her eyes wandering between the two inside the compartment with an uncertain look. "Come in, there are a few free seats." Since Asterion didn't bother to respond, the young girl spoke in his place. "Thank you." The girl with voluminous hair thanked and stored her own suitcase on the racks above the seats. Afterwards, she sat down next to the other young girl, and silence once again settled in the compartment. But it didn't last long, as the girl with brown hair introduced herself timidly. "I'm Hermione Granger." Whether it was Asterion or the other young girl, they both raised their heads and greeted her back. "Rose Potter." "Asterion Black." As the two stated their names, Hermione widened her eyes and looked at them both with an incredibly shocked expression. Even Rose looked surprised at the young man. "I've read about you too," Hermione spoke excitedly without stopping, quoting some books about them. Asterion simply glanced at her and went back to reading his book. He didn't find the girl annoying, just busy reading at the moment. Seeing that Asterion ignored her, Hermione felt her smile stiffen. Seeing this, Rose, who didn't want to pay attention to the conversation, comforted young Hermione. "Don't worry about him, he's always like this." "It's okay, I'm used to it," Hermione spoke with a helpless smile and a sad look. Then, she heard the voice of the incredibly handsome young man. She noticed that his voice was cold and almost emotionless, but still very pleasant to listen to. "I ignored you because I'm busy at the moment, Miss Granger, nothing more. Don't take my silence as an insult." Hermione nodded, understanding, as she also didn't like to disturb her reading time. "By the way, cousin, I would appreciate it if you didn't call my book stupid." Raising his head and looking directly into Rose Potter's incredibly blue eyes, which seemed to have stars in them, combined with her white hair, and you knew her identity. The current bearer of the 6 eyes, Rose Lily Potter, the girl who lived. Chapter 38, Hogwarts Express, 2, Cousin. Rose, who until a moment ago had been showing boredom, looked at the handsome young man in front of her with surprise. Raised only among the Dursleys, the sudden news caught her off guard. "What's so surprising? You probably have cousins in almost every noble house. That is, before your great-grandfather Henry Potter became pro-Muggle. After that, you were probably erased from every family tree." Asterion answered her doubts, while curiously eyeing the legendary six eyes. The revelation left Rose stunned. Hearing his words, she realized she probably had dozens of cousins she had never known. Are we close cousins or distant ones? Rose asked, looking at him with her bright blue eyes. Asterion tried to remember the chaotic Black family tree before responding. Our closest relationship is through your great-uncle Charles Potter, who married Doria Black. Rose nodded, silently absorbing all the information that had been dumped on her and its consequences. Hermione noticed the silent atmosphere and observed Asterion and Rose, trying to find some resemblance, but they were completely different from each other. One had white hair, the other black hair, one had beautiful blue eyes, the other dark red eyes. No matter how much she looked, they didn't look anything alike. Rose's thoughts were interrupted when the cabin door opened and a boy with red hair entered, wearing clothes slightly too big for him and sporting a shy expression. Sorry, all the other cabins are full, he said, looking at everyone. His gaze paused for a moment on Rose, and he couldn't help but open his mouth, his cheeks gaining a shade similar to his hair. Clearly drawn by Rose's appearance, which was not surprising given that the girl was truly a goddess in the making. Ron Weasley, he introduced himself, looking away, lacking the courage to stare at Rose for too long. Rose Potter, Rose introduced herself indifferently. As for the boy's shy appearance, she wasn't surprised, she was very used to such situations. What was strange was the black-haired boy in front of her who didn't react to her appearance. Hermione Granger, the girl introduced herself, not liking the abrupt entrance into the cabin, especially if there was a girl changing at the moment. Asterion remained silent and didn't introduce himself, which was considered rude, but he knew they couldn't be friends, so he didn't need to waste saliva. Not that he harbored any hatred or dislike for the boy, he simply knew they wouldn't get along from the start. Upon hearing Rose's name, Ron's eyes widened, and he looked eagerly at her, moving closer and sitting next to her, squeezing Hermione away regardless of the brown-haired girl's protest. He asked excitedly, "Do you have the scar?" Rose frowned and looked coldly at the boy. She didn't like his approach at all, nor did she like having pushed Hermione away from her. Despite this, she lifted her bangs and revealed the lightning-shaped scar on her forehead. Upon seeing the scar, Ron gasped and blurted out his question almost instinctively, unaware of the weight of his words. "Do you remember that night?" If Rose's initial impression of Ron was merely one of indifference, it had now transformed into a slight disgust. She couldn't comprehend how someone could broach such a delicate subject in such a manner. The almost cheerful tone with which he spoke about her parents' death only intensified the feeling of repulsion she was experiencing at the moment. "Mr. Weasley, it's not very polite to ask such a delicate question," Asterion intervened, closing the book firmly and interrupting the tense atmosphere that had settled in the cabin. Ron, finally waking up to the gravity of his question, tried to quickly apologize, but he was cut off by Rose. "No need to apologize. I'm not that fragile." Her voice sounded indifferent and cold as her eyes stared at Ron with an icy gaze. Ron swallowed hard under Rose's piercing gaze, as if a mountain rested on his shoulders, making even the act of moving seem like a daunting task. "Fascinating," Asterion murmured to himself, sensing the magical energy in the air and realizing the impressive control that Rose exerted over it. It was on a completely different level from his own. If he were to engage in a battle of attrition, he knew he would likely be defeated. He would expend more magical energy than Rose, who flawlessly controlled her magical energy at a subatomic level. An achievement considered insane. The tense atmosphere hung in the air, preventing anyone from initiating a conversation. Not that Asterion wanted one, but Rose didn't plan to let him remain silent. "So, Asterion, do I have any more relatives in your family?" she asked, ignoring the awkward atmosphere in the cabin. Narcissa Black, seemingly without crimes, Bellatrix Lestrange, wanted for numerous murders of muggles, half-bloods, and purebloods, my uncle, Sirius Black, also a wanted criminal for blowing up an entire street of people, and my great-grandfather, Arcturus Black III, Asterion replied without hiding anything. He opened the book again and continued reading, unconcerned about what others might think of his family. Rose couldn't help but purse her lips upon hearing his indifferent voice, indifferent to the deeds of his relatives. She realized that the family of this cousin she had just met wasn't exactly one of the best, most of them were wanted criminals. Asterion Black. Ron, who had overheard everything, jumped from his seat and pointed at Asterion in shock. It was only now that he had recognized the most notable genius in the current British magical world. Ron Weasley. Asterion rolled his eyes and replied in a nonchalant manner. Turning his attention back to the book, he continued, "I'd like to say it's a pleasure to meet you, but we both know that's not true." This made Ron's face turn red, not with shyness, but with anger. What teenagers most value at this age is self-esteem, something Ron didn't have much of in the first place, living in a crowded house with few financial resources. "It's a miracle from Merlin that your whole family isn't already in Azkaban," Ron retaliated as best as he could think of at the moment. Asterion merely raised an eyebrow slightly at the redhead's words. "Was that supposed to be an insult?" asked the black heir. "And isn't it?" Ron replied through gritted teeth. "If the whole family is included, your father is probably going to Azkaban, my dear cousin. Don't forget that Arthur Weasley is the grandson of Arcturus Black too." Asterion revealed information that left Ron staggering as he couldn't manage to utter a single word. Note, don't confuse Arcturus Black 2 and Arcturus Black 3. Arcturus 2 is the uncle of Arcturus 3, who is the great-grandfather of our protagonist. By the way, it's canon. I was also quite surprised by the revelation. You liar." He pointed at Asterion with a trembling finger, unable to finish the sentence properly. It wasn't just Ron who was shocked. Rose, who was listening to everything, opened her mouth and looked at the redhead. If Ron was Asterion's cousin, Ron was also her cousin. Looking at the trembling finger pointed at him, Asterion's red eyes gradually grew colder. "You better stop pointing at me, or else I'll rip your hand off." At the end of the sentence, Asterion released his malice without any scruples, unconcerned about the consequences of his actions. The entire train seemed to fall into an ice cavern, all the students regardless of age feeling chills running down their spine as a deep fear settled in the heart of each person on that train. Chapter 39, Hogwarts Express, 3. In the presence of Asterion's aura, Rose remained perfectly calm, curiously observing the boy's shadow, while the imposing hundred-eyed hound captured all her attention. It was a special grade cursed spirit, but she couldn't understand why the cursed spirit obeyed Asterion's commands. Could it be his innate technique? She thought, looking at Asterion with growing curiosity in her intense blue eyes. It seemed that this cousin was truly intriguing. As a special grade witch, Rose was fine, but the situation was entirely different for Ron and Hermione. Their faces paled, and their eyes widened with horror and fear. A sadistic and chilling laughter echoed in their minds, almost causing their hearts to stop beating. Suddenly, everything ceased, as if nothing had happened, except for the sweat covering their bodies. "What was that?" Gasping, Hermione asked, looking at Asterion with a terrified gaze. She had seen cursed spirits before, but this was an entirely different level. It was as if she were facing a cold, emotionless monster. Ignoring the frightened girl, Asterion directed his gaze at Ron and spoke coldly. "If your father were here, he would probably be humbly kneeling, asking for permission to speak, let alone you, his son, so behave yourself or I will make you behave." Ron's cheeks flushed, almost as if they were burning, but he remained silent, still haunted by the feeling of suffocation and fear that had overwhelmed him moments ago. It was the scariest thing he had ever experienced in his life. "Did you have to scare Hermione?" Rose, who had suddenly appeared beside the girl, spoke while gently comforting her, still disturbed by the events that had just unfolded. Asterion rolled his eyes at Rose and turned to Hermione, apologizing gracefully as he placed his hand over his chest. "I apologize, Miss Granger, it wasn't my intention to scare you. Sometimes I can be a bit reckless." Asterion didn't lie. Despite being more mature than most of his age, he was still just a 13-year-old boy after all. He wasn't perfect, Asterion acknowledged his flaws. Like any extremely powerful teenager, he was impulsive, arrogant, sarcastic, and often quite cruel and sadistic. He knew his flaws, but at the same time, he didn't want to change, at least not at the moment. Upon hearing his apology, Hermione was surprised for a moment. She nodded as she looked at him and moved closer to Rose, cautious of the most handsome yet extremely frightening boy she had ever seen. As for Ron, he seemed to be ignored by everyone in the cabin. It was as if he were invisible. This forced the young man to leave to avoid embarrassment, but as he was about to exit, the cabin door was opened once again, this time by a handsome teenager with platinum blonde hair and an arrogant look on his face, followed by two large and almost identical teenagers. Although the young man's smile lasted only a second after seeing Asterion inside the cabin. Lord Sirius Black, Draco forced a smile on his face and greeted him, though anyone could see the discomfort on his face. Heir Malfoy, Asterion also greeted him with a cold look. If there was one person he disliked and even harbored hatred towards, it was the teenager in front of him. Draco Malfoy was someone he had despised and wanted to kill for a long time. He was only alive because of Narcissa. If it weren't for her, he would have reduced the entire Malfoy manor to ashes. The pain he caused Narcissa was enough for Asterion to want to gut him like an animal, along with his father and the entire Malfoy house. So, came to kiss my shoes like your father or something else? Heir Malfoy, seeing Draco standing there, Asterion continued to speak, his voice dripping with sarcasm and irony. Asterion was humiliating him on purpose. To Lucius Malfoy, it didn't matter if it was Asterion or Voldemort, the man would kneel and kiss his shoes without batting an eyelid if it brought power and wealth to the Malfoy house. Draco clenched his fists and tightened his jaw. His blue eyes, inherited from Narcissa, practically burned with anger. I heard rumors that Rose Potter was on the express and wanted to meet her, Draco said, suppressing the growing fury in his chest. He calmed down and responded with a polite smile on his face. Asterion simply pointed to Rose and Hermione, who watched the scene with curious eyes. Draco followed his direction and saw two teenagers, one with white hair and the other with brown hair. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Lady Potter. My name is Draco Malfoy, son of Lucius Malfoy. Draco focused his attention on the white-haired teenager, greeting her with the most charming smile he possessed. He continued speaking with gentle and flowery words. I am a big fan of your feats as a baby. Rose only looked at him with interest, but precisely she was curious to know the relationship between Draco and Asterion. They seemed like enemies, but in her eyes, Draco was too weak for such a feat, so their animosity must have come from somewhere else. The courage of fools, Asterion scoffed, looking at Draco showing off like a peacock. Was that it? Did Lucius really send Draco to seduce Rose? The thought made him laugh, but the joke was really bad, even tasteless. Aren't you going to greet my friend? Rose, who began to feel bored again, asked, pointing to Hermione beside her. Draco looked at her and scanned her from head to toe. He didn't recognize the girl, he didn't remember her attending any parties. Hermione Granger, although uncomfortable with his scrutinizing gaze, Hermione introduced herself. Knowing that there was no Granger house in Britain, that only meant one thing, and it made the beautiful smile on Draco's face stiffen. He looked at the girl with a look of disgust. Mudblood. Hermione remained indifferent to the racist comments. It wasn't the first time she had been called that. In Diagon Alley, she was called that by some arrogant boys and girls. She learned not long after what the word meant, but in the end, it didn't matter. As her mother had told her, she ignored the words of others and moved forward with her head held high, like a noble queen looking at her subjects. Rose, although she didn't know what it meant, was not foolish, and she could see that it was an offensive term. The sense of amusement she had for Draco turned into deep disgust in a mere instant. What she hated most in life was bullying. I think it's time for you to leave, Mr. Malfoy. Rose looked at Draco and spoke slowly with a slight coercion emanating from her. Lady Potter, you'll learn that some people are better than others, Draco tried to argue, feeling the pressure on him increasing with each passing second. I have eyes to identify trash, you don't need to worry about that, Rose sarcastically replied as she increased the pressure even more. She was kinder than Asterion. If it were him, he would have made the boy kneel until he passed out. Draco, feeling he couldn't bear the growing pressure anymore, gave one last resentful glance at Asterion and hurriedly left the cabin with his henchmen, leaving Rose, Hermione, and Asterion behind. Well, that was certainly a scene straight out of a children's book, Asterion commented sarcastically. Rose rolled her eyes at his words, noticing that Asterion was particularly sarcastic, but not in an annoying way, in a fun and ironic way, as he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Do you know something interesting, Lady Potter? Asterion looked at Rose and spoke mysteriously. First of all, drop the lady, just call me Rose, I'm not an old noble lady. Before Asterion could continue, Rose interjected with an impatient expression. Ignoring her request, Asterion spoke with a growing amusement in his eyes. Lady Potter, did you know that the blonde who just left is the son of Narcissa Black? Although dissatisfied with still being called Lady, Rose couldn't help but curse how incestuous her ancestors were. Couldn't they just find other families further away? Capitulo 40 Expresso de Hogwarts. 4. Under Asterion's pragmatic and cold gaze, Rose pursed her lips, feeling like a lab rat under those eyes. Any problem, vampire? Rose asked, lazily leaning back. With an especially irritating smile, she crossed her legs and stared at him. Vampire? Asterion asked, confused. From head to toe, you literally look like a vampire, so handsome it's almost inhuman, Rose pointed out, still smiling. Would that make you a snowflake or a snowman? Prefer an ice cube or ice cream? Asterion sarcastically replied. He had no intention of falling behind in the word game. Rose's smile tightened, realizing she had met a worthy opponent. However, she would not back down without a fight. For a bloodsucker, you sure have a poisonous tongue, she retorted, her blue eyes sparkling with amusement. But the next scene momentarily made Rose and Hermione lose their composure. They saw Asterion's hand suddenly bleeding, but what shocked them the most was seeing him stretch out his tongue and slowly lick the crimson blood from his pale skin. An enveloping aura emanated from him, making it difficult for the two girls to look away. Hermione swallowed hard and reluctantly averted her gaze. The scene was too intense for her 13-year-old mind. Her imagination began to conjure up countless inappropriate scenarios for her age. Has anyone ever told you that you're a sexy bastard? Rose coughed to cover her own expression, looking at her cousin with a hungry look. Many times. Women tend to get quite excited around me, Asterion replied casually, finishing licking the blood from his hand. His lips were now stained crimson, resembling a forbidden fruit trying to entice people to taste its sweet nectar. Rose and Hermione both cursed and mentally thanked the woman who brought Asterion into the world. He was literally the embodiment of sin, tempting them to sin as much as possible. What was most irritating was that Asterion was aware of his own appearance and used it as a deadly weapon, especially against them, young maidens who had never tasted the flavor of love. Do you already know which house you'll be placed in at Hogwarts? Perhaps realizing that Asterion was not like the other young people she had met before, Hermione asked, her brown eyes shining with a spark of wisdom and curiosity, basic qualities of a book lover, something that Asterion also shared. Slytherin. If I end up in another, it's possible that Arcturus will come to Hogwarts and burn that filthy hat, Asterion replied. Although the idea of letting Arcturus freak out if he ended up in Gryffindor was tempting, he still wanted to be in Slytherin, mainly because of the man's heritage in that magical castle. Filthy hat. Rose and Hermione looked at him, confused. Hogwarts has 4 houses. You will be sorted into one of them based on your personality and morality. This test is done by a very old and dirty magical hat, Asterion revealed the secret without much concern. It wasn't a big deal in his eyes. Rose and Hermione exchanged surprised looks. Hogwarts was truly magical. At the same time, they longed for the school even more. Observing Rose devouring the freshly bought sweets without caring about her image, Asterion covered his face with his palm to avoid seeing the scene. Are you sure you don't want to try these chocolate delights? I don't understand how someone could not like the supreme food of the gods, Rose said, swallowing a chocolate frog and squinting with pleasure as she felt the sweetness overflow on her tongue. You shouldn't eat too much chocolate, Rose. It's bad for your teeth. My parents are dentists and recommend staying away from chocolate, Hermione intervened, adopting a tone of reproach for the sake of her new friend's health. Don't be such a killjoy, Mione. Enjoy the sweet taste of sugar. Rose ignored Hermione and popped a piece of chocolate into her new best friend's mouth, disregarding her protest. I'll pass. Not a fan of chocolate, Asterion recoiled, dodging a chocolate crumb. His words made Rose widen her eyes, looking at Asterion as if he had committed an unforgivable crime, a heretic, a lost lamb of God. She approached him with quick steps and stared at him inches away. Their eyes met intensely. How can you not like sweets? They're cute and lovely, every bite is like biting into divine perfection. She spoke with her face dangerously close to his. I said I don't like chocolate, not sweet things. Pushing her face away with his hand, Asterion spoke slightly uncomfortable. He really didn't like close contact with strangers. Perhaps sensing his discomfort and knowing this was her chance to get back at him for the sexy scene he made her witness earlier, Rose flashed a mischievous grin and sat next to him, putting her arm around his neck, pulling him closer. Tell me, why does the cute little puppy in your shadow obey you? She asked, whispering sensually into his ear. Asterion displayed a rather helpless expression on his face. He wanted to punch the delicate and pretty girl for her audacity to touch him, but stopped, realizing he couldn't harm her due to limitless, even though they were in such close proximity. He could feel limitless, acting like a second skin, protecting Rose in all directions. Creation and manipulation of cursed spirits. I won't explain because the name is self-explanatory. Asterion pushed her arm away from his neck and moved back, looking cautiously at Rose. He had already placed Rose in the weird category, the same category as Bellatrix. By the way, adorable Baskerville? Are you blind or something? He was created to be as frightening as possible. The words adorable and Baskerville don't mix under any circumstances. In a world like ours, you seem like a Pokémon master, catching all sorts of Pokémon, Rose spoke with genuine admiration in her voice. Then, as if struck by an idea, she looked at him with an extremely excited expression. Tell me, can you create a Pikachu, can't you? She asked, gripping his shoulders, her blue eyes seeming to burn with a flame of hope. Is that it? You've really reduced one of the most powerful innate techniques on the planet to a mere Pokémon master? Asterion was stunned. There were so many things to create, and she chose a Pokémon. Besides, has Pokémon really been released earlier in this world? You seem like a culturally ignorant man, Starlight. Let me guide you through the world of Japanese anime. Rose put her arm around his neck again and said with a cheerful and contagious smile. Starlight? Asterion just let out a resigned sigh and didn't say anything about the nickname. He felt that even if he contested, she would ignore him. Besides, he realized that his reputation could be ruined sooner or later if he got too close to her. Don't be so petty, it's just a Pokémon. You probably can create thousands with a snap of your fingers. You're literally the Pokémon god. Rose continued to insist, wishing for a Pikachu in particular. But Asterion remained indifferent to her requests. Seeing that she wouldn't be able to change his mind no matter how hard she tried, Rose showed a mischievous look and subtly threatened him. Believe it or not, it's better for me to receive a Pikachu, or we'll be training a lot. Asterion just scoffed at her threat. Training? If we were to do that, I'd be rubbing your face in the ground. Just you. No offense, but you're weak. Rose laughed and spoke, with a particularly irritating tone. You seem confident for someone addicted to sweets. Asterion spoke indifferently, starting to emit his magical energy lightly. I'd say it's you who's confident, bloodsucker. Rose challenged, maintaining her provocative tone. Her magical energy clashed with his, creating small gusts of wind inside the cabin. Seeing that things were spiraling towards an inevitable fight, Hermione quickly intervened. "We're on a train, don't forget that." Tisk. Rose clicked her tongue and reined in her magical energy. Hump. Asterion just huffed and also reined in his magical energy. Seeing the two calming down, Hermione sighed in relief and rubbed her forehead, feeling a massive headache coming on. Capitulo 41 Expresso de Hogwarts, 5, Asterion and Rose, who had calmed down, were now engaged in separate activities. Asterion was absorbed in his reading, accompanied by a glass of wine beside him, ignoring the reproachful glances he received from both girls. Meanwhile, Rose and Hermione were deepening their friendship without any barriers, as if they had been friends for a long time, despite having only known each other for a few hours. "Rose, about my innate technique." Before Hermione could finish her sentence, Asterion interrupted her. "Miss Granger, I must warn you that discussing your innate technique is a rather intimate matter. I'm not saying not to share it with the snowflake, but avoid discussing it in the presence of others, like me," he said, looking seriously into her eyes. "Is something wrong?" Hermione was taken aback. The innate technique is a rare treasure for wizards. It is the foundation of a noble lineage. Having an innate technique means that your descendants can inherit this ability, solidifying the status of a noble house, Asterion patiently explained. Not everyone possesses an innate technique. Having an innate technique implies having a much higher potential than those who have only awakened their magical energy. Hiding your innate technique can bring benefits in the future, especially against your enemies, as they would not know what your trump cards are. For example, the Potter family is famous for the 6 eyes and the limitless. One could say that in every noble house, there is a book explaining all the strengths and weaknesses of the Potter family's innate technique. The Black family is the same. Practically everyone knows the strengths and weaknesses. Hermione nodded and looked gratefully at Asterion, while at the same time, she clenched her fists happily, knowing she had more potential than most. She had always been the best in school and intended to continue that way at Hogwarts. Listening to his explanation, Rose scoffed. "It doesn't matter if they know or not, in the face of true strength, strategies, conspiracies, and lies are nothing but paper tigers." Asterion rolled his eyes at the girl's arrogant words. If he thought he was arrogant, Rose was even more so than him. Which was no small feat. Asterion was really arrogant, but not on Rose's level. Rose looked at Asterion leaning against the seat by the window and asked curiously, "Star, you're really a noble, right?" "I am," Asterion replied, looking at her with a puzzled expression at the question. "Is it like in the books?" "I mean the noble society, full of conspiracies, murders, and political intrigues." "It's similar, but reality often surpasses fiction," Asterion responded, with a cold look. "There are indeed political intrigues, alliances, and rivalries among noble families. But most of the time, the real battles are fought behind the scenes between factions, away from the public eye. It's a complex game, where cunning and power are the main currencies." Rose seemed intrigued by Asterion's response. She tilted her head, absorbing the information. "Then, have you been involved in any of these games?" she asked, with a curious sparkle in her eyes. "More than I'd like," Asterion replied, still maintaining an indifferent expression. Asterion explained the factions clearly, revealing not only the structure of the British Wizarding Society, but also the complexities of power relations between them. Rose listened attentively, absorbing every word with evident interest. "So, the Sacred 28 are the oldest and most influential noble houses," Rose summarized, processing the information. "And the Light faction is led by Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard in the world." "That's right," confirmed Asterion, watching her reaction closely. He could see the intelligence and cunning in Rose's eyes, characteristics he considered crucial in a plan. He hoped to disrupt Albus Dumbledore's plans somewhat. It was obvious that the man wanted Rose to take his place as leader of the Light faction, something that was not in Asterion's interest. A weak light faction was essential for him to seize power without much difficulty. And the neutral faction, led by the Greengrass family, is sort of a balance between the other two? Rose inquired, connecting the dots. Exactly, Asterion nodded, impressed by how quickly she grasped it. The Greengrass family acts as a mediator and maintains a certain balance of power between the factions. Hermione, who listened to the conversation with interest, seemed fascinated by the details revealed by Asterion. She absorbed every piece of information eagerly, her intellect eager to understand the nuances of this hidden and shadowy world of politics. But the balance has long been broken, Asterion spoke, causing the two young women to look at him curiously, eagerly awaiting his words. I have officially become a special grade wizard, shattering the fragile balance of power, especially with my engagement to the heiress of the Greengrass family. One could say we control almost this entire country. Rose could understand what Asterion was saying. She was a special grade wizard according to Hagrid and could grasp the weight of what that meant. She could literally destroy entire cities with just one red. And her cousin was one too. But Hermione didn't know. To her, the personal power of an individual being able to influence an entire nation was somewhat unreal. But it wasn't her fault. She could never have imagined she was standing next to people capable of destroying entire cities. So, your marriage to Daphne further strengthens your position in wizarding society, Hermione commented, with a gleam of understanding in her brown eyes. Yes, it's part of a larger strategy to consolidate our power and influence, confirmed Asterion, without revealing all the details of his plans. Rose, on the other hand, was more interested in the personal dynamics between Asterion and his fiancée. Do you really like her? She asked, curious to know more about the love life of her distant cousin. Asterion pondered for a moment before responding. Like is a complicated word, but I respect Daphne and recognize the importance of our alliance. As the conversation continued, Rose and Hermione began to grasp better the complexities of the world they were about to enter. The train continued on its course toward Hogwarts, and with it, the lives of these young wizards were about to intertwine in adventures and challenges that would shape their destinies in unpredictable ways. Chapter 42 Hogwarts 1. Lower your heads, children. Asterion, Rose, and Hermione lowered their heads at Hagrid's shout and raised them again after crossing the bridge. Beautiful. A collective sigh echoed over the moonlit lake. There was no other word to describe what these young wizards and witches were feeling at this moment, seeing Hogwarts for the first time. The castle atop the hill seemed to possess a strange allure and mystery that made you unable to look away from it. It felt like ancient magic resonating with the very essence of all magic, like a primal, ancient heartbeat. The castle seems alive, Rose murmured, gazing at the castle. If it isn't, it's not far off, Asterion heard her murmur and nodded, looking at the castle. Should I be able to create a living castle? He wondered. He thought that if he could, he would be the first to do something like that. Even his ancestors hadn't thought of it. We're arriving, mind your step when getting off, children, Hagrid, alone in a boat, shouted again. The boat beneath him seemed like it would sink at any moment with his enormous weight. But in the end, upon reaching the dock, the small boat survived another day. Stepping off the boat and onto the wooden bridge, Asterion quickly distanced himself from the boat, more precisely, from the fourth occupant who was on the boat, a girl with beautiful pale blonde hair and dreamy silver eyes. She had 2 carrots as earrings in her delicate ears. Asterion recognized the girl, there was no way not to. But recognizing her and wanting to approach her were 2 different things. He had already exceeded his quota of crazy women in his life. One Bellatrix was enough. But the girl didn't think the same way. Can I pet him? She asked, approaching Asterion, who continued to step back, her dreamy eyes wandering in the shadow of the black air. No, he particularly dislikes people wanting to pet him, Asterion denied without any hesitation. We'll never know unless I touch him, the girl insisted, staring directly into Asterion's eyes, as if she were looking straight into his soul. Looking into those eyes, Asterion couldn't help but notice the familiarity they shared with Gellert Grindelwald's eyes, the Dark Lord. Rose and Hermione laughed, watching Asterion constantly backing away, but every time he moved back, she moved closer, creating a rather amusing scene where a boy retreated and a girl approached. For them, it was truly amusing to see the cold and indifferent Sirius Black, a special grade wizard, fleeing from a seemingly harmless girl. While Asterion kept backing away from the girl, Hagrid, in front of the crowd of new students, banged heavily on the gigantic wooden doors, creating a loud sound. It didn't take long for the doors to open, revealing a middle-aged woman with stern features. Her hair, almost entirely white, was arranged in an elegant bun, and she wore emerald robes and glasses on her eyes. "Professor McGonagall, I've brought the new students," Hagrid said, his voice naturally loud. "Thank you for your hard work, Hagrid." "I'll take care of the children now," she replied, looking at the nearly 300 teenagers, who fell silent with a simple glance from her. Hagrid nodded and left with heavy steps, but not before waving to Rose at the back of the crowd, who also waved back gently to him. "Follow me in silence," Professor McGonagall said, fully opening the massive wooden doors. Soon, almost 300 boys and girls followed quietly into the castle. "I have to say, I'm curious how Hagrid's parents met," Asterion, who had managed to shake off the girl with dreamy eyes, murmured to himself, after watching the giant human hybrid disappear with a lantern in hand. To give you some context, a giant typically stands between 4 to 6 meters tall. The tallest recorded human reached a maximum height of 2.72 meters, 8 feet 11.1 in, and weighed 199 kilograms, 439 pounds. Still, faced with a giant, they seemed like a child barely reaching the waist, so the idea of a giant and a human mating and conceiving was something that left Asterion very confused. Rose rolled her eyes upon hearing the murmuring of her new friend, or at least, she thought they were friends. One thing she noticed about Asterion was that the boy was particularly curious about everything. But not on a normal level. Anything he found interesting, he had a rather unsettling gaze, almost like a mad scientist looking at his subject. She resolved to keep an eye on Asterion to prevent him from dissecting some students out of curiosity. In front of all the new students, Professor McGonagall began to explain the basics to them. "Hogwarts has 4 houses: Gryffindor, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff. You will be sorted into one of them after a test at the sorting ceremony." She continued to explain until they reached another pair of massive doors. Before entering, she said to the new students, "Before you enter, straighten your clothes and correct any inadequacies in your attire." In the midst of the crowd, a girl with black hair adjusted her skirt when suddenly, she felt someone tap her right shoulder. "I'm busy, Gwen. I wasn't talking to you, Melina." The girl looked confusedly at her friend who was on her left and then glanced to her right. She saw a transparent face smiling eerily at her. "Ha!" She let out a terrifying scream that startled everyone around. But it was just the beginning of pandemonium, as more and more ghosts emerged through the walls, frightening the new students. What followed was a symphony of screams of horror and fear. Asterion remained indifferent to all the commotion. Cursed spirits were far more terrifying than these ghosts, so he wasn't afraid. On the contrary, he discreetly looked with greed at the hundreds of ghosts flying above the students. Due to Hogwarts, ghosts might seem common, but they're not at all common in nature. The requirements for a soul to transform into a ghost after death were at the very least challenging. Firstly, you have to die in a location with a high concentration of magical energy, preferably on top of ley lines, which is not easy to find. Hogwarts, for example, was built on top of one of the most important ley lines in the world. Secondly, you have to have an intact soul. Thirdly, you have to die with great remorse. And finally, you have to die with the body relatively intact. Discreetly, Asterion made a hand seal, connecting his thumb to his index finger, forming a circle. In the next moment, one of the hundreds of ghosts flew discreetly to Asterion, who simply opened the pocket of his pants and the ghost was sucked inside. Looking around, he found Rose's incredibly blue eyes staring at him with an amused look and a mischievous smile on her lips. Asterion remained indifferent upon realizing he'd been caught and continued to look straight ahead as if nothing had happened. Chapter 43 Hogwarts 2. Seeing that all the students had calmed down after the ghosts left, McGonagall nodded satisfactorily and finally opened the doors. Asterion noticed that the dining hall was much larger than depicted in the movies, which was perfectly normal. The number of students in Hogwarts reached into the thousands. Looking up, he saw the famous starry sky above the dining hall. He appreciated the beauty of the stars for a moment and then refocused on his surroundings. All the older students were seated at 8 tables, 2 for each house. Slytherin had the smallest number of members, while Gryffindor and Hufflepuff vied for the house with the most members. The Gryffindor members were the loudest, followed by Hufflepuff. The Ravenclaw members were quieter and more discreet, whispering instead of talking aloud. The Slytherin members were in complete silence. Asterion almost instantly felt the gaze of most members fall upon him. The ones who didn't look were probably those with Muggle-born or mixed-blood descent, who ended up in Slytherin. Looking over to the teacher's table, Asterion's gaze fell upon the current most powerful wizard in the world, Albus Dumbledore. And Asterion had to admit, the man was unparalleled in power, even more so than Gellert Grindelwald. Albus Dumbledore possessed the most devastating innate technique in the world, capable, according to rumors, of annihilating the world itself. Looking at him, Asterion confirmed that these rumors were true. Rumors said that the man's innate technique was related to the sun, and Asterion believed it. The tiny amount of magical energy emanating from Dumbledore carried an unimaginable scorching heat. As if sensing Asterion's gaze, Dumbledore turned his eyes to him with a gentle and warm smile. If it weren't for the immense magical energy of the man, Asterion might have mistaken him for a simple innocent old man. "What do you think, Lady Potter?" Asterion murmured to Rose, beside him. Rose rolled her eyes at the way he addressed her. He called her Lady Potter on purpose to annoy her, but she still responded sincerely. "Strong, about 1.5 times the magical energy I currently possess. If I want to surpass him, it should take me about 2 to 3 years. But if we were to fight using only innate techniques, I should win now, since his technique is entirely focused on destruction." "Just to clarify, you just said you would defeat the current strongest man in the world," Asterion commented, still incredulous at Rose's arrogance. Let's not mention the vast difference in combat experience between Rose and Dumbledore. Just the number of spells the man could cast was headache-inducing for any special-grade wizard. With an irritating smile, Rose looked at Asterion with an arrogant air and declared, "It's not arrogance, it's pure reality. Besides, he won't hold the title of strongest man in the world for long, that title will be mine." From that moment on, Asterion didn't consider himself arrogant. Rose possessed that characteristic more than he did. Midline horizontal ellipsis beside a chair in front of the teacher's table, Professor McGonagall picked up a scroll and announced the first name on the list. Abbott, Hannah. A visibly nervous girl emerged from the crowd of freshmen and took her seat in the chair, facing all the students directly. Professor McGonagall picked up the sorting hat and placed it on Hannah's head. 30 seconds later, the hat shouted loudly, "Hufflepuff." The Hufflepuff table erupted into applause. McGonagall transfigured the girls' robes to match the chosen house theme. Hannah stepped down from the chair with a smile and quickly made her way to the Hufflepuff table. Professor McGonagall continued calling out one student after another until it was Asterion's turn, which didn't take long as he was at the top of the list. Black, Asterion. The hall almost instantly fell silent. In England, Asterion's fame was almost as great as Rose's, especially with the help of Rita Skeeter. The peak of Asterion's fame came after his birthday party, when Rita wrote an article about the relationship between Asterion and the fearsome Dark Lord, Gellert Grindelwald. One could say that no one would be surprised if Asterion declared himself a Dark Lord. Asterion doesn't seem so scary, he's very polite and courteous. "I don't see why everyone is afraid of him," Hermione said beside Rose, noticing the fear in many people. But how could she know the terror people lived through 13 years ago, where everyone lived under constant fear of being killed at any moment? Rose just smiled and didn't care about the tense atmosphere in the hall. Her attention was entirely on Asterion. Now she could understand why he was so cold and indifferent. Ignoring the stares falling upon him, Asterion walked, and everyone made way without saying a word. Before taking his seat, Asterion directed his gaze to the teacher's table, focusing on the man in the purple turban beside Severus Snape. Even before arriving at Hogwarts, Asterion had decided to deviate from the original story. After all, only a fool would stay under the same roof as a lunatic like Voldemort, who wouldn't hesitate to destroy Hogwarts to achieve his plans. So, Quirinus Quirrell needed to die. Asterion was undecided about how and where. Maybe he would even call Rose to join in the fun. After all, both of his parents had perished at the hands of Voldemort. But initially, Asterion didn't expect Voldemort to actually appear as in the original plot. After all, Rose was a special grade which, even at his peak, Voldemort wouldn't stand a chance against her, especially now that he was just a fragment of a soul. However, to his surprise, he could feel an absurd amount of resentment emanating from Quirinus. There was no doubt that the former Dark Lord who once terrorized all of Britain had been reduced to a mere parasite. Asterion was simply perplexed by how Voldemort expected to defeat Rose. "Is there a problem, Mr. Black?" Professor McGonagall looked confused by his sudden pause. "It's nothing, Professor, just pondering something interesting," Asterion replied indifferently. With that said, he took his seat and crossed his legs, one over the other, looking out across the entire dining hall as a king would gaze upon his subjects. Chapter 44 Hogwarts 3. Feeling the hat being placed on his head, Asterion soon heard a curious voice. "Hello, my young lord, may you ask your cursed spirit to allow me to check your character?" As Asterion had mentioned earlier, Baskerville was created to protect him from everything, including mind rapists like Snape and Dumbledore, who were masters of occlumency and legilimency. Asterion spoke with Baskerville, and the hat managed to perform its job clearly. It spoke with a voice full of wisdom and curiosity. "How interesting. Helga would embrace you with her unwavering loyalty to your family. Rowena would open her private library to you with her insatiable thirst for knowledge. Godric would teach you his precious swordsmanship with his bravery. Salazar might invite you to dissect some interesting snake he found. I must say, you are the most challenging person I've had in my 1,000 years of existence, my young lord." Even Merlin wasn't as difficult. The man had a heart of gold with his love for muggles despite being from Slytherin. "But I really didn't expect a direct descendant of one of my creators to marry a Black. I must say, it's an unexpectedly fitting combination." The Sorting Hat continued to speak without pause as Asterion listened with curiosity. To his surprise, the hat was analyzing its own soul. The process of such an act was so meticulous and precise that it left him speechless with the genius behind its creation. "Do you wish to be in any specific house, my young lord?" The Sorting Hat asked, giving Asterion the option to choose for himself. "Slytherin, please. If I end up in Gryffindor, my great-grandfather might want to set you on fire. He was already fed up with you putting Sirius in Gryffindor," Asterion mentally spoke to the Sorting Hat. "Sirius Black, I remember the young lad. He broke the 1,000-year tradition of the Black family. Before him, all members of the Black family went to Slytherin." The Sorting Hat spoke with a voice full of amusement, showing no fear of Asterion's words. He continued, "Before I announce your house, by the order of all 4 of my creators, I have an obligation to say something, my young lord. If you wish to awaken your second-inborn technique, seek out the Chamber of Secrets. Salazar Slytherin's heritage resides in the Chamber of Secrets, along with the method to awaken your second-inborn technique currently dormant." Before Asterion could even speak, the Sorting Hat spoke for the entire hall to hear. "Slytherin." Everyone at the Slytherin table stood up and applauded, a shower of applause in respect for their future leader. Asterion descended from the chair, and his robes gained a green hue along with the crest of Slytherin House. Casting a slightly arrogant glance at Rose and Hermione, he walked over to the Slytherin table and took a seat in an empty spot. Nobody came to speak to him at the moment because it wasn't an appropriate time. The sorting ceremony continued, and some new students were sorted into Slytherin, such as Draco and his cronies, whose names Asterion didn't bother to remember. The notable students sorted into Slytherin included Amelia Bulstrode, Tracy Davis, Theodore Knott, Pansy Parkinson, and Blaise Zabini. In addition, obviously, his fiancée, Daphne Greengrass. It wasn't the first time Asterion had met Daphne. The Greengrass heiress had often visited Black Manor over the past 3 years to get to know each other and deepen their relationship. Asterion had also visited Greengrass Manor to meet his future in-laws and sister-in-law, Astoria. It could be said that they knew each other well. They had learned a lot about each other over these 3 years. For Daphne, Asterion respected her, as she had renounced many things for her family. Perhaps that's why their relationship was good, even though there was no love at the moment, but they both respected each other, which Asterion greatly appreciated. The first time they met, Asterion was surprised to recognize her as the same girl who had danced at the birthday party. What he had expected to be just a passing encounter in his life turned into the first of many, and perhaps for his whole life, until the end of his days. Daphne, under the accusatory and envious glares of the Slytherin girls, especially from Pansy Parkinson, elegantly sat down beside Asterion. "I sensed your magical energy on the train. Is everything all right?" Daphne asked discreetly, her shoulders touching Asterion's. Beside Daphne sat a girl with brown hair and chocolate-colored skin, Tracy Davis, Daphne's close friend, someone Asterion had met when visiting Greengrass Manor. "It's nothing. Just a particularly irritating red-headed nuisance," Asterion replied, looking at his fiancée with a slightly gentler gaze. She noticed his look and offered a small smile, her lips stained with red lipstick. "Weasleys tend to be irritating at Hogwarts from what I've heard," Daphne murmured to him. Before she could continue, applause rang out throughout the great hall, so loud it seemed to make the place tremble. All of Slytherin table looked up and noticed a girl with white hair walking amidst the thunderous applause of everyone. "Rose Potter! Rose Potter! Rose Potter!" Daphne looked at the legendary Rose Potter with a curious gaze. After all, she was the girl who lived, the one who held the record for defeating a Dark Lord when she was just a baby. "Is she powerful?" Daphne asked Asterion. "Yes, in a fight to the death. I can kill her at the cost of dying myself," Asterion replied indifferently, watching Rose sitting in the chair. "I didn't expect her to be a special grade witch." Daphne narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. "Dumbledore certainly hid her very well from the magical world." "You're wrong, Rose Potter wasn't raised in the wizarding world. I dare say she was raised with her muggle relatives," Asterion whispered to her. This made Daphne widen her eyes. She couldn't believe that the savior of the British magical world was raised by muggles. But then she realized something. Her blue eyes fell upon the old man sitting in the head chair. Dumbledore did this intentionally to prevent Rose Potter from siding with the pure bloods. Knowing the pain of muggle-borns, Rose would fight for the rights of the most disadvantaged class. "I didn't expect Dumbledore to think decades ahead." Daphne sighed in wonder at Dumbledore's foresight. "That old man may seem innocent, but he's more cunning than all the patriarchs of the noble houses combined." Asterion huffed coldly. "Gryffindor." The applause sounded even more grandiose as the Sorting Hat spoke. The Gryffindor table practically turned into a wave of noise and chaos. The noise naturally ceased when Professor McGonagall looked at the students of the house she oversaw. After all the new students were sorted into their respective houses, Albus Dumbledore gave a speech to all the students and ended with a strange phrase that nobody understood. Dinner was served, and everyone who was hungry ate eagerly. Asterion and Daphne ate in silence until the entire sorting ceremony officially ended. All students followed their respective prefects to the common rooms. The password to enter the common room is pure blood. If you forget, you'll have to sleep outside or hope someone opens it for you, the Slytherin prefect told all the new students. The Slytherin common room was located beneath the Black Lake. Casting a dim, slightly greenish illumination, the predominant color was green with touches of silver, giving the entire common room an elegant and cozy ambience. The chair next to the fireplace is the seat of the Slytherin leader, belonging to the strongest person in the entire house, the prefect continued, introducing everything to the new students. Asterion glanced at the chair and walked towards it. The prefect wanted to reprimand the arrogant new student, but upon seeing who it was, wisely remained silent. Sitting in the chair, Asterion crossed his legs and looked at all the members of the Slytherin house. His red eyes gained a phosphorescent hue, appearing especially sinister under the dim light of the room. Beside him, Baskerville materialized and rested his head in his master's lap, his 100 eyes coldly surveying the teenagers and young adults. From this day forth, I am the law, I am your king and ruler. I don't care what you think of me, but know that those who dare challenge me will suffer. His cold and regal voice sent shivers down people's spines. Looking at everyone for a moment, Asterion continued, during my reign at Hogwarts, I intend to change the entire Slytherin house. I don't want others to fear or despise us, I want the other houses to look at us and feel envy for not being in Slytherin. For those who obey my orders, I will personally teach and train them in private lessons on Saturdays. When Asterion said this, regardless of age or gender, everyone looked at him with excitement. They all knew he was the second special grade wizard in England, meaning they would be personally trained by one of the most important figures on the planet. At this moment, even if Asterion wanted to change the house crest, they would accept it without hesitation. The older students supervised the younger ones, reminding them not to forget the rules. Asterion stroked Baskerville's head in his lap. I'll give you one warning. Rose Potter is someone you cannot touch, she's a special grade witch. If you don't want to be humiliated, stay away from her. His final words made the faces of the older students change drastically. Perhaps the patriarchs of each noble house would hear about this news the next day. Rose Potter being a special grade witch changed everything. It meant that the Light faction possessed 2 special grade witches. Next chapter, Chapter 45 Classroom, 1, Chapter 46 Classroom, 2, Chapter 47 Classroom, 3, Chapter 48 First Class of Defense Against Cursed Spirits, 1, Chapter 49 First Class of Defense Against Cursed Spirits, 2, Chapter 50 Request, 1, Chapter 51 Request, 2, Chapter 52 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 1, Chapter 53 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 2, Chapter 54 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 3, Chapter 55a. Treacherous Game of Chess, 4, Chapter 56 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 1, Chapter 57 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 2, Chapter 58 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 3, Chapter 59 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 4, Chapter 60 School Council, Chapter 61 Mission, 1, Chapter 62 Mission, 2, Chapter 63 Mission, 3, Chapter 64 Mission, 4, Chapter 65 Mission, 5. Chapter 45 Classroom, 1, September 2, 1993 Thursday. Hogwarts. As Asterion got ready in front of the full-length mirror, a curtain of darkness formed beside him, and from it emerged a creature resembling a bat, not large, almost the size of an adult man's palm. It looked somewhat cute, upon closer inspection. Go and find the Chamber of Secrets, Asterion spoke as he adjusted his green tie. The bat nodded obediently and transformed into thousands of bats, which soon disappeared, but Asterion knew they were only invisible in the room. Opening the door of the room with a spell, Asterion let the thousands of invisible bats out and closed the door to the room again. Early yesterday morning, Asterion took advantage of everyone being asleep and headed straight to the girls' bathroom determined to enter the Chamber of Secrets. Unfortunately, the chamber wasn't there. Someone had moved the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets to another location. As for who, there was only one option: Voldemort. Besides himself, he was the only descendant of Slytherin in this castle. But Asterion had to admit that the man worked fast, knowing that the Sorting Hat would likely inform him about the Chamber of Secrets. The Dark Lord wisely moved the chamber to another location. But it was a move destined to only delay the inevitable. He would find the Chamber of Secrets sooner or later. Seeing that he was properly presentable in the mirror's reflection, Asterion nodded satisfactorily and left the room with his wand in its holster. He had transfiguration class in the morning, together with the Gryffindors. Asterion had to admit that releasing his bats was a smart move. Besides searching for the Chamber of Secrets, the bats also served as guides. He soon arrived back at the cafeteria. Besides him, there were 4 other awake students eating, 2 from Ravenclaw, 1 from Hufflepuff, and 1 from Gryffindor. In addition to the students, Dumbledore was seated in the head chair and waved to him, greeting him. Asterion nodded in response and sat at the Slytherin table. He quietly ordered the dishes he wanted, and magically, they appeared on the table. He had to admire the Hogwarts house elves. They were extremely efficient. Not surprising considering they serve thousands of people every day. Asterion ordered a glass of wine to accompany his bread, eggs, and sausage, with mashed potatoes. But before starting to eat, he looked at Dumbledore and gestured to the seat next to him in the enormous chair that served as seating for everyone, clearly inviting him to join him for the meal. Dumbledore seemed surprised for a moment but then appeared seated beside him. He was the only one who could apparate within the confines of Hogwarts, a feat ingeniously accomplished by Rowena Ravenclaw. "I'm over 100 years old, but this is the first time I've sat at the Slytherin table," Dumbledore said playfully. His blue eyes looked kindly at Asterion, ignoring the other shocked students as the situation unfolded in front of them. Asterion narrowed his eyes. Although Dumbledore had not sat at the Slytherin table, he had certainly spent a lot of time in Grindelwald's company, which was practically the same thing. "I met my cousin, Rose. She wasn't raised in the wizarding world." Eating a piece of toast, Asterion spoke while looking at the most powerful man in the world. "Fame can sometimes go to people's heads, making them arrogant. I didn't want that for little Rose," Dumbledore replied, ordering his own food, an authentic English breakfast with eggs, bacon, toast, tomatoes, roasted mushrooms, sausages, chorizo, and baked beans. "Yes, of course you didn't want that," Asterion emphasized the "you" very sarcastically. Dumbledore acted as if he hadn't heard his sarcasm and asked while eating a sausage, "How is Lord Arcturus?" "Last I saw him, he was as strong as a dragon." Feeling perhaps that Dumbledore knew about Arcturus's critical condition, Asterion responded coldly, "He's doing well, although he might dream of strangling you while he sleeps." Dumbledore just chuckled amusedly at his words. "We've always been rivals. He's one of the few people from my generation still alive." He spoke with a hint of nostalgia in his voice. Asterion truly didn't know if those words were true. The man in front of him was a true master at hiding his own emotions and showing what you wanted to see in order to get closer to you. Seeking to take control of the conversation from Dumbledore, Asterion asked, "Can I enroll in the exorcism course in advance?" The exorcism course was only accessible in the 4th year when students began to undertake missions, but Asterion didn't want to wait that long, especially since he would be called upon anyway to deal with special-grade cursed spirits. Dumbledore stroked his long beard, pondering for a moment before responding. "It's not impossible for you, but your team would have to be adjusted. After all, you're still a special-grade wizard. Your missions would be extremely dangerous for someone below grade 1. He continued, "I'll speak to the school council, but don't expect a response too soon, young Asterion. Those old-fashioned sticklers don't like things that defy the rules, especially for someone like you, a special-grade wizard." Asterion scoffed coldly at the man's words, but he knew Dumbledore wasn't lying. The more powerful someone was, the more guarded the people of this country would be, especially after the war 13 years ago, where the wizarding population in England dropped by almost 30%. No one wanted to see another Dark Lord anytime soon, especially him, where the House of Black had produced 7 Dark Lords over millennia. As mentioned earlier, no one would be surprised if Asterion declared himself a Dark Lord. But honestly, he didn't know how these people thought they could control him. Political power. Faced with absolute strength, such conspiracies were child's play. Perhaps that was the problem with politicians. They had been controlling the country for so long that they forgot the world was still ruled by the strongest fist. As Asterion and Dumbledore conversed, more and more students arrived at the cafeteria, and without exception, they were all shocked to see Dumbledore sitting at the Slytherin table. Especially the Slytherin members, who exchanged glances and saw the same look in each other's eyes. What to do in this situation? Sit next to Dumbledore. Everyone shook their heads suddenly and almost instantly dismissed the idea. After whispering quietly to each other, they all decided to make space and isolate the two, ignoring both of them for the time being. But before everyone sat down, they all greeted Asterion with respect and admiration in their eyes, regardless of their age. "Good morning, Lord Black." "Good morning, Lord Black." "Good morning, Lord Black." "You seem to have won everyone over rather quickly," Dumbledore remarked, noting the admiring glances the students gave Asterion. "Slytherin above all values self-preservation, the weak follow the strong. That's the law this world has followed since ancient times," Asterion spoke indifferently. "Blindly following a person isn't conducive to good. After all, we are human and we make mistakes much more than we'd like," Dumbledore offered his opinion, looking deeply at Asterion. "If a ruler is powerless, it will be reflected in their governance. Incompetence leads to ruin, ruin leads to death and destruction," Asterion countered, staring at the man without flinching. "No one likes to be controlled so deeply, it's inevitable that someone will rise against the system," Dumbledore spoke calmly. "That's inevitable, but when everyone receives benefits, the majority will ignore the minority. When everyone is satisfied, no one wants to pay attention to others." Asterion knew very well that human nature is inherently selfish. Everyone feels pity for someone, but few are willing to step out of their comfort zone to help someone in need. Dumbledore remained silent and looked at Asterion with his particularly bright blue eyes at that moment. Dumbledore finished his meal and apparat to the teacher's table. As soon as Dumbledore left, all the Slytherins sighed with relief. Sitting next to the enemy of their parents was not a pleasant feeling. It seemed like they were sitting on pins, they could barely stay still in their seats. Asterion felt an intense gaze upon him and looked towards the teacher's table, more precisely at the man with oily black hair and a particularly pronounced nose. Severus Snape, the potions professor. Asterion didn't know what the man was thinking, nor did he care. As a double agent like himself, the Black Heir held a slight disdain for him. It wasn't because of Snape's choices, but rather due to what he naturally felt as someone who desired to reign. To a king, what he detested most was traitors. But at the same time, he wouldn't antagonize the man, he was nothing more than a chess piece destined to be discarded sooner or later. It was futile to harbor resentment for the dead. Chapter 46 Classroom 2. When Asterion continued to eat, Daphne and Tracy sat on both sides of him, preventing certain girls from getting close to him. Pansy clenched her teeth, watching this, the bread she was holding practically twisted in her hands. If the bread were conscious, perhaps it would lament its sad fate. It wasn't enough to be devoured, it had to suffer such torture. "Good morning," Daphne greeted him, kissing his cheek, the cold expression she usually wore around everyone seeming surprisingly kind at this moment. "Good morning," Asterion greeted her back, even Tracy, who sat on his left side. "I heard you were talking to Dumbledore at the Slytherin table," Daphne asked curiously. Tracy also listened with great curiosity. "I called him for a conversation, the conversation was at least enlightening," he replied, falling silent for a moment as he speared the sausage with his fork. Though it seemed like a simple divergence of ideologies, it was something deeper. That conversation meant Asterion and Dumbledore had no possibility of cooperation in the future. Dumbledore was content with the current system, where everyone maintained a fragile balance, keeping the entire society in relative peace. But for Asterion, it was the opposite. The Ministry of Magic had to cease to exist for him to control the entire British magical society. To create the god that the House of Black envisioned, the entire island of Great Britain had to be in his hands. In other words, Asterion would dismantle the existential order and establish a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, to be more precise. Absolutism wasn't suitable, centralized power in one person would only bring more problems than benefits. As Arcturus had mentioned before, the foundation of a society lay in the interests of the people. Daphne didn't ask any further, noting her silence, Asterion would tell her something if necessary. In addition to conversing with Daphne and Tracy, Asterion also spoke with the first years sitting near him. Surprisingly, he found it somewhat pleasant to converse with Blaise Zabini and Theodore Knott. Both showed respect for him, but they discussed interesting topics rather than typical teenage matters. "I heard your mother got married for the 5th time," Zabini, Theodore, a handsome boy with black hair and brown eyes, asked, looking at Blaise with a curious smile. Blaise, a very handsome black teenager, just groaned in frustration at his friend's question. "Yes, my former stepfather recently passed away, so she got married again." "How did your stepfather die?" Theodore continued to ask with a mischievous smile on his face. Blaise's mother was a beautiful and very charming woman, well known in aristocratic circles for her marriages, which always ended with her as a widow and a substantial amount of gold filling her coffers. With so many deaths, everyone naturally suspected that the woman was killing her own husbands to inherit the rich estates left by them. However, the Ministry of Magic's investigations always determined that they were accidental deaths or due to illnesses, sometimes even natural causes in some cases, dismissing suspicions against the woman. The ministry placed great importance on such cases. After all, it involved the inheritance of wizards, something quite delicate in England. Despite such a reputation, the line of suitors for the woman was surprisingly long. Everyone thought it was just simple bad luck. "He fell down the stairs and broke his neck," Blaise replied with a slightly disgusted expression, as if remembering something very unpleasant. Everyone around found the situation quite amusing. There was no denying it, Blaise's mother's husbands were indeed unlucky. Seeing this, Blaise just sighed and said nothing. Breakfast ended with Asterion, Daphne, and Tracy leaving together. Class was about to begin. Blaise and Theodore didn't try to get too close to Asterion, avoiding making the teenager feel uncomfortable with their sudden proximity. Midline horizontal ellipsis. The first class of the day was Transfiguration in the morning. Entering the classroom with Daphne and Tracy by his side, Asterion quickly glanced at the teacher's desk and saw a cat staring at him with a gaze that closely resembled Professor McGonagall's. "Why is there a cat in the classroom?" Tracy murmured to herself as she tried to pet the cat, but to her disappointment, the cat skillfully dodged her hands with surprising grace. "Don't run away, I'm a good person," Tracy persisted. As a cat lover, she refused to let a feline go without any affection. Asterion, sitting in the back row of seats, watched the whole scene with an amused look dancing in his eyes. It wasn't every day that he would see the strict Professor McGonagall evading a student. "She hasn't noticed yet," Daphne said, her tone tired, as she sat beside Asterion. Under the table, her hand found his, intertwining their fingers. Asterion looked at her with a puzzled expression but didn't comment on her actions. Observing this, Daphne couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for her mother. The woman certainly knew how to win someone over. To any casual observer, simply holding hands wouldn't be anything extraordinary for betrothed couples, but initially, Asterion had been reluctant to even sit close to her. It wasn't out of dislike or for any other reason. Her fiancé simply didn't feel comfortable around strangers, including herself, his fiancée. After sharing the situation with her mother, Helena tasked Daphne with a mission, to approach Asterion cautiously. First, she was to let him get used to her presence, subtly getting closer to him and touching him until he became accustomed to her touch. She did this for months, until finally managing to touch Asterion without him looking at her with coldness. Daphne had to admit that the routine was quite eerie. When you're accustomed to something, you hardly notice when that something happens. Even the inaccessible and indifferent Sirius Black wasn't immune to this. "Let her be, at least we can have some fun watching," Asterion replied, looking at Tracy chasing the cat around Professor McGonagall's desk. Seeing that she couldn't pet the cat, Tracy noticed that the class was about to begin, with more and more students arriving. Determined, she looked at the cat, promising herself that she would pet it in the future regardless of what happened. Seated beside Asterion, as she had promised Daphne, she occasionally gave fleeting glances to the cat. Rose and Hermione almost arrived late but finally entered before the appointed time. Unfortunately, a certain red-haired boy wasn't so lucky. Ron, who had just entered the classroom sweating, sighed in relief to see that the teacher hadn't arrived yet. However, as he prepared to sit down, the cat on the teacher's desk suddenly transformed into a middle-aged woman dressed in emerald robes, shocking all the students, or at least those who recognized the cat's identity. "Mr. Weasley, you're late," she said, addressing the boy with a gaze capable of intimidating any unruly teenager. "I got lost, Professor," Ron tried to explain, gaining some relief as he saw the teacher's expression soften slightly. After all, it wasn't uncommon for a first-year student to be late with Hogwarts' numerous confusing staircases. "You'd better not be late again, or I'll turn you into a pocket watch," she warned the boy with a cold look. McGonagall looked at the class with seriousness, her gaze briefly stopping at the frightened Tracy, but she continued after a brief pause. "Before we proceed with the lesson, I must inform you that transfiguration is one of the most difficult and dangerous branches of magic. A simple mistake can turn something harmless into something perilous. Therefore, while you're in my class, I demand absolute attention, or I won't hesitate to expel the inattentive for an entire year." Her stern voice carried seriousness and authority, leaving almost all the students nervous, some even straightened up in their seats. As she noticed the entire class listening attentively, a look of satisfaction gleamed in her eyes, and she continued. "Transfiguration is the art of shaping matter with your will and determination." While Professor McGonagall taught the basics of transfiguration, in the back of the classroom, Tracy complained to Daphne and Asterion. "You didn't tell me about Professor McGonagall." "Believe me, it was hilarious to watch you try to pet the professor," Daphne said with a mischievous smile on her lips, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "How cruel, Daph. You're getting more sadistic spending time with Asti." "You weren't like this before," Tracy said resentfully. Asterion just rolled his eyes at the nickname. Tracy was the only one who dared to call him that. It was something he obviously allowed, given that he had known her long enough and she helped him keep the girls from getting too close to him. Believe him when he says that teenagers are surprisingly annoying. Every time he attended a ball over the years, he found himself completely surrounded by girls, something that particularly annoyed him, as he had a slight dislike for the touch of strangers. "It's better to focus on the class. The professor has already started to notice your whispers," Asterion murmured discreetly to the girls while keeping his eyes on the lesson, efficiently taking notes of Professor McGonagall's words. He would never let the words of a transfiguration master like Minerva McGonagall, who had won several international awards, pass him by. Daphne and Tracy stopped their discussion and focused on the lesson. Chapter 47 Classroom 3. While taking notes during transfiguration class, Asterion felt one of his bats had been killed. The last image transmitted to him was of a tall, muscular teenager with black hair and blue eyes. Even though 3 years had passed, he recognized the one person who lacked magical energy, Neville Longbottom. Asterion furrowed his brow, trying to recall Neville at the sorting ceremony, but found he wasn't there. Yet, clad in red and gold robes, the eldest Longbottom had been sorted into Gryffindor. But he shouldn't have been, for he lacked magical energy and wasn't even qualified to enter Hogwarts in the first place, unless Dumbledore needed another squib like Finch. Interesting. With the pen placed against his lips, Asterion displayed a slightly sadistic look. Dumbledore must have really pulled some strings to let Neville into Hogwarts. Don't think the prejudice against Neville was exaggerated. In a society based on magical supremacy, someone without magic was extremely discriminated against. Many squibs weren't even worthy of being recorded in the family tree. As Asterion pondered deeply, unaware that Daphne and Tracy were staring at him intently. "Your fiancé is dangerous, Daph," Tracy murmured, feeling her heart race faster. Despite spending a lot of time with Asterion, she wasn't immune to that devilishly handsome appearance. Especially when he wore that wicked expression on his face, which made him ridiculously sexy, just like the villains in the erotic novels she secretly read away from her mother's prying eyes. "I have to stop falling in love with the villains in books. But it's not my fault. The protagonists lack so much charisma and are only slightly handsome." Tracy thought, with a helpless look in her brown eyes. Daphne agreed with her friend's words, but at the same time, she found it incredibly exhausting to keep the girls away from Asterion. It wasn't just once or twice that she had to have a private conversation with the Slytherin girls. Although she felt her efforts were futile, the girls seemed to agree with her words, but deep down, they probably thought completely differently. Having a handsome and incredibly powerful fiancé had proven incredibly difficult, but she wouldn't give up. Asterion was hers by right, and she wouldn't let any excited bitches get near him. Your first lesson is to transform this matchbox into a needle, Professor McGonagall spoke as dozens of matchboxes flew into the air with a wave of her wand. Each matchbox landed directly in front of each student. The closer to the perfect appearance of a needle, the more points you'll earn at the end of the lessons, she continued, her intense gaze sweeping over each teenager in the classroom. Everyone nodded and drew their wands, chanting the incantation taught by Professor McGonagall, Commutare. Obviously, there were no changes in the matchboxes. Wrong, you have to believe. The key word is believe. If you don't believe you can do it, neither will magic. Passing by a Slytherin student, Professor McGonagall patiently explained, regardless of the fact that the boy was from a rival house. After that, she went from table to table, helping the students, regardless of their house. Perhaps that's why Professor McGonagall was popular in all four houses despite her strict demeanor. Rose, next to Hermione, gently waved her wand and silently muttered the incantation. Instantly, the matchbox changed its square shape, narrowing and then rounding, and a silver needle appeared on the table. 10 points to Gryffindor. Looking at the perfectly silver and pointed needle, Professor McGonagall exclaimed aloud. Excellent work, Miss Potter. It's the first time in 40 years that a student has managed to transform a matchbox into a needle in their first lesson. Professor McGonagall expressed her appreciation in her words. Thank you, Professor, Rose responded with a smile. Keep it up, Miss Potter, but try to challenge yourself. Show me the results at the end of the class, she said, then walked over to another student behind Rose. Hermione looked at Rose with a spark shining in her eyes. I won't lose, Rose, the girl said resolutely. Then let's compete to see who earns more points by the end of the month, Rose suggested, leaning her head on her hand with a playful look. She truly appreciated Hermione. Instead of feeling envious like other girls, her friend aimed to better herself. This was rare for Rose, who had always been the target of other girls' envy because of her appearance. Having a genuine friend for the first time was a breath of fresh air. At the back of the classroom, Asterion transfigured the matchbox into a needle on his first attempt. It wasn't a challenge for him in the first place. He already had plenty of experience in such matters, especially in creating cursed spirits in the form of objects like swords and armor. Transfiguring a matchbox into a needle wasn't difficult for him at all, he even adorned the needle with intricate figures of several crows along the small silver shaft. Having a wand proved quite useful in these minute details, it helped him control the precision almost surgically. Then, Asterion heard a loud voice beside him. 20 points to Slytherin. Looking to the side, he found Professor McGonagall looking at him with a gaze full of praise. Good job, Mr. Black. Magnificent work. If you weren't a first year, I would have suspected I was looking at the work of a fifth-year student, she spoke, sparing no compliments. Thank you. I have the best teacher possible, Asterion replied with a calm demeanor. Unbeknownst to him, a subtle smile appeared on his lips. Being praised by this admirable woman was a very pleasant feeling, it wasn't the shallow flattery he had always heard from others. Indeed, Minerva also felt quite happy to be praised sincerely. After all, everyone enjoys compliments, regardless of age or gender. I'll say the same words I said to Miss Potter. Challenge yourself. The only limitation in transfiguration is your mind, she said, then glanced at Daphne beside Asterion. She looked at the needle, which could hardly be considered a needle, and said, 5 points to Slytherin. Miss Greengrass, you didn't focus enough during the transfiguration process. Remember, Focus is crucial during transfiguration. Any mistake will reflect in what you're trying to transfigure, the woman explained the errors Daphne made with a stern voice. Thank you, Professor, Daphne sincerely thanked her. After the professor left, Tracy looked at the two and spoke nonchalantly, you two are monsters. I could only briefly change the matchbox. For Asterion, such a result is normal given his inherent technique. Mine is also quite favorable for transfiguration, but the real monster is Rose Potter. Her inherent technique isn't directly related to transfiguration, yet she can transfigure on the first try. That insane control over magical energy is really hard to imagine, Daphne murmured, still feeling amazed by the performance of the six-eyed bearer. With the help of those eyes, she was practically born for transfiguration, with her subatomic control over magic, Asterion spoke calmly, while constantly changing the needle on the table. Instead of changing the object itself, he altered the material, color, and Venn texture. Doing something that many seventh-year students would never achieve. After all, few people are truly interested in transfiguration, most prefer spells or runes. That's the difference between someone talented and someone who lacks talent. Something someone trained for 20 years cannot be compared to a genius who achieved it in just 1 year. It's truly unfair, but nothing in this world is fair. Is she really that amazing? Tracy asked curiously. Give her a month, and with her control, she could probably transfigure you into a noodle, Daphne joked, looking at her friend with a mischievous grin. Even though Tracy knew Daphne was joking, she felt a chill run down her spine. I think I won't be getting too close to her, she said with a smile that was slightly unnerved. Asterion rolled his eyes at the girl's banter and focused on the lesson. Midline horizontal ellipsis transfiguration class ended about 2 hours later. Rose earned 25 points for Gryffindor, Asterion 30, Daphne 10, and Hermione 10. This added up to 40 points for Slytherin and 35 for Gryffindor. Almost inevitably, the classroom divided into two sides, on one side, the Slytherin students, and on the other, the Gryffindor students, each trying to outdo the other. Asterion realized that the school seemed to be fostering this division on purpose. However, this separatism between the houses was something more serious, it could become something bigger if not handled well. Nevertheless, all students had only 10 minutes to get to the next class, which posed a challenge for the first years. The Slytherins were lucky to have Asterion guiding them to the dim and damp potions classroom. Asterion didn't like the dark and humid atmosphere of the potions classroom, nor did he like the subject at hand. Potions were not something he wanted to get involved with, he was terrible at those magical recipes. Potions, alchemy, and predicting the future were areas he wanted to stay away from. He couldn't stand still in front of a cauldron or involve himself in the complicated processes of alchemy. Predicting the future was something he especially detested, especially after the encounter with Grindelwald at his birthday party. That chilling smile on the man's face while he clapped still sent shivers down Asterion's spine. But make no mistake, although he was terrible at making potions, he recognized the value of potions that could potentially save his life at some point. He kept a stock of vials containing a variety of potions in the stomach of a cursed spirit specially created to hold things. Though it cost a considerable amount of gold, he was wealthy and cared little for the expense, even if it amounted to tens of thousands of golden coins. Fortunately, during this potions class, his fiancée was an excellent practitioner of the discipline, which was to be expected given her background in the Greengrass family. When all the students arrived promptly in the classroom, a man whom Asterion almost thought was Batman entered, dressed in a long dark cloak that seemed too large. His hollow, dark eyes watched everyone, his gaze briefly stopping at Rose before continuing until it landed on Asterion, who looked back at him with an indifferent and particularly cold stare. I do not expect you to understand the beauty of potions. This branch of magic performs true miracles in the form of liquids. I can change your appearance, make you experience love, save you when you are dying, even manipulate your luck. In this class, you will not simply wave your wands stupidly, you will follow my orders, and if you do not, you had better be prepared for the consequences. Snape's cold voice echoed through the dark and damp classroom, making the students feel slightly frightened by the eerie atmosphere, and even more unsettled by him. The sound of people swallowing was particularly audible in this silent environment. Asterion didn't conceal his dislike on his face. If Minerva McGonagall was a teacher worthy of the sacred title of educator, Severus Snape was the opposite. The man shouldn't be teaching anyone, let alone children. The disinterest in his voice was as clear as the bitter man's monotonous life. Snape picked up a parchment with the names of the students and began the roll call. As he looked at a specific name, he directed his cold gaze towards Rose. "Oh, a celebrity, the girl who lived, what an honor," he said with obvious sarcasm in his voice. Rose simply smiled widely at the professor's words. "Sorry, I don't give autographs to humanoid bats," she replied, her own sarcasm not concealed. With Rose's voice echoing, everyone, regardless of their house, turned their gazes towards her with veiled admiration on their faces. Snape's face twitched slightly. -10 points for Gryffindor for answering back to the professor, Snape said, looking coldly at Rose. "You might as well take all the points at once, because every time you speak, I'll respond right back," Rose replied, smiling broadly, her hands behind her head. Her incredibly blue eyes stared at Snape with clear amusement dancing in them. They both stared intensely at each other, but Snape finally looked away. Asterion didn't know if the man would be as brave once he realized he had offended a special grade witch, news that probably had already spread in aristocratic circles. Women could be especially vengeful, Bellatrix was a clear example of that. She had killed Rodolphus's mistress and child in front of the patriarch of the Lestrange family. Snape still didn't know who he was dealing with. Rose didn't seem like someone who would tolerate injustices quietly. The class continued as normal, with Gryffindor losing more and more points for every basic mistake made. On the other hand, Daphne earned more points, while Asterion only assisted her with the potion ingredients. Another person earning points was Draco's twin sister, Doria Malfoy. Speaking of Doria, the teenager was practically a copy of Narcissa, both in mannerisms and in her innate arrogance. Asterion didn't sense any trace of negative magical energy in the girl, which meant she didn't practice the simplified inherent technique of the Black family, but rather the inherent technique of the Malfoy family, the Wheel of Fortune. It was mostly a passive ability, aimed at seeing luck and even manipulating it to some extent. The ancestor of the Malfoy family in France had performed true miracles with this technique, but in the hands of Lucius Malfoy, this ability hadn't worked out very well, as the losses he suffered and continues to suffer in the 13-year war still haunt him to this day. Like her twin brother, Doria looked at Asterion with clear dissatisfaction in her blue eyes but didn't dare to reprimand him, perhaps due to her father's orders. As for the siblings' dissatisfaction, Asterion was very clear. Both resented him for taking Narcissa away from them, which was contradictory because neither of the twins cared about their mother until they finally realized how much they missed her. Only then did they demonstrate resentment towards Asterion. On the Gryffindor side, Hermione showed a certain talent for potions. The potions she brewed were acceptable, but Snape never awarded any points to the brown-haired girl. This deeply irritated Hermione, but unfortunately, her resentment meant nothing in the face of Snape's pleasure in punishing Gryffindor for the slightest mistake. The disgust Asterion felt for Snape deepened even further. He ardently wished to send Baskerville to devour the piece of trash that was the man, but he held back in the end. Creating a murder scandal on the first day of class wasn't something he desired. Perhaps in the second or third week. However, Hermione's friend didn't stay silent about what was happening. Rose didn't miss the chance to mock Snape, making the professor's cold face appear even more expressionless. This forced the man to use his occlumency skills to the fullest, not showing any emotion in the face of the white-haired girl's sarcastic comments. After 2 hours of class, all the students, even those from Slytherin, couldn't stand being in that environment anymore and almost ran out of the classroom. As it was lunch break, everyone headed to the cafeteria. The Gryffindors were unusually silent. Obviously, everyone was disheartened by the previous lesson, especially knowing they would have many more classes with Snape in the future. I can't believe that man is a teacher, Hermione said through clenched teeth. She had never been punished by a teacher in her life. Her exemplary conduct was something she prided herself on, but that shining record of years had been tarnished countless times today. You can imagine the girl's anger at this moment. Don't worry about that trash, Mione. We can earn many more points in other classes, Rose comforted the girl, hugging her from behind. Since Hermione was smaller than Rose, she fit perfectly in the white-haired girl's arms. Hermione's cheeks flushed with the sudden embrace, but she didn't pull away from her friend. Still, the points we earned in Professor McGonagall's class disappeared, and Slytherin is at the top of the house standings. At this rate, we'll lose the house cup, Hermione murmured, still dissatisfied with the treatment she received from Snape. Rose just laughed and didn't mind, continuing to comfort her friend regardless of the people around her. Midline horizontal ellipsis in the cafeteria, Asterion, Daphne, and Tracy sat at the Slytherin table to eat, and as they were about to start eating, they saw a white-haired teenager walking towards the Slytherin table and sitting down, regardless of the shocked looks from everyone in the cafeteria. Little star, Rose greeted Asterion with a smile. When she said that, everyone at the Slytherin table grimaced, and when someone was about to laugh, a friend next to them reminded them and held back the laughter. Asterion couldn't help but want to punch Rose's pretty face. The girl knew exactly how to irritate him. "What do you want, Snowflake?" he said coldly, looking at her. He just wanted to finish this conversation quickly and eat. "Well, I want to know why Snape dislikes me so much," Rose asked without caring about Asterion's cold look, as she ordered her own food, seemingly planning to have lunch at the Slytherin table. "Your father stole the woman he loved, what do you think?" Asterion replied sarcastically. My lovely mother was quite popular," Rose chuckled after hearing Asterion's words. Not only did she hear, but everyone at the table heard. Asterion didn't lower his voice and spoke slightly louder than usual. Hearing about Severus Snape's life was definitely something everyone wanted. They even forgot there was a Gryffindor sitting at the Slytherin table. Asterion continued to speak, regardless of how many listened. He even wanted all of Hogwarts to hear his words. "But it's not just that. Your father, James Potter, and my uncle, Sirius Black, were the main ones who made his life at Hogwarts a complete hell. Our relatives weren't exactly nice at our age, if you catch my drift," Asterion spoke, knowing about Rose's troubled childhood, even probable abuses by her maternal Muggle family. The smile on Rose's face vanished with Asterion's words. She didn't expect her father to be someone like Dudley. This left a lasting bitter taste in her mouth. It seemed like the sins of the fathers fell upon the son, meaning her. Fortunately, she wasn't a helpless girl like when she was a child who didn't know anything. "Thank you for telling me," Rose sincerely thanked him and left with her food, returning to the Gryffindor table. That was surprisingly informative. Theodore not spoke, breaking the silence among them. Who would have expected Snape's hatred towards Gryffindor to be like that? Tracy sighed as her eyes still burned with curiosity. She continued speaking with an excited look. "A love triangle that turned into a relationship full of hatred and resentment. I think I could write a book based on this." Everyone around rolled their eyes at her dramatic words. Chapter 48 First Class of Defense Against Cursed Spirits 1. After lunch, there were still 3 classes left, flying at 3 p.m. and, at the end of the day, History of Magic, the last class being the most special. The first one was taught by Professor Binns, a ghost who had died in his sleep and continued to teach to this day. The second one was led by Madame Hooch, a woman with piercing yellow eyes, reminiscent of a hawk's eyes. The flying class itself didn't catch Asterion's attention. He could fly on his own without any problem. But as a man, he felt particularly revolted sitting on those broomsticks. Even after years living in the magical society, he still didn't understand how witches and wizards could sit on those brooms without hurting their private parts. That was the first flying class and the last one he would attend because he would never sit on a broom again. Instead of hurting himself by sitting on a broom, he would rather ride Nidhogg and fly on top of a damn dragon. As for what the school would think of him skipping classes, Asterion couldn't care less. If anyone complained, Baskerville was especially hungry those days, and he wouldn't mind feeding his faithful companion. The penultimate class of the day was History of Magic, during which Asterion nearly dozed off while hearing about the Goblin Rebellion and the Giant Wars, topics as antiquated as Professor Binns himself. The ghost seemed to have a strange enthusiasm for history, something the Black Air couldn't comprehend. After the end of the History of Magic class, it was time for the class Asterion was slightly interested in, Defense Against Cursed Spirits, taught by Edward Milliton, a veteran Auror from the Ministry of Magic. This class was one of the two that were exclusive to the reality of this magical world, the other being magical self-defense tactical training. Edward was a middle-aged man, around 40 years old, with partially gray hair and cold gray eyes. A scar marked his face below the eyes, extending to the jaw. He wore black trousers and a gray vest over a white shirt. His posture was firm and imposing, like someone who had witnessed many things and faced many challenges. The Defense Against Cursed Spirits class took place in a vast open space, with students from all four houses present, hundreds of teenagers nervously watching the professor. Asterion's small group was in the front row of Slytherin members. "Are we going to face cursed spirits on the first day?" Tracy murmured, clearly nervous, as she looked at the cages behind the professor with a hint of fear in her eyes. No one responded to her. Even Daphne seemed nervous. Perhaps the only people who appeared perfectly calm were Asterion and Rose, and as for the reason for this calmness, it didn't need explaining. Edward looked at all his students in silence and began to speak, his voice reaching everyone present effortlessly. "I am Professor Edward Milliton, the instructor for Defense Against Cursed Spirits." He paused to let everyone process the information and continued, "Unlike Defense Against the Dark Arts, which specializes in combating dark wizards and shadowy creatures such as vampires, werewolves, and others, this class is exclusively focused on efficiently combating cursed spirits." Walking across the floor covered in brown tiles, he gestured towards the huge cages covered with white sheets behind him. "Some of you may have noticed the cages behind me, and as you might imagine, they contain cursed spirits." As he said this, all the students became agitated, and not without reason. Regardless of their background, they were, after all, just teenagers and had never seen a particularly fierce cursed spirit without parental supervision. "Silence," Edward frowned, speaking coldly. His rough, cold voice made the agitated teenagers fall silent. "In this class, we won't be fighting cursed spirits. The goal is simply to get you accustomed to seeing them, which will help prevent you from freezing completely when encountering them on your future missions." His words alleviated some of the tension in the room, but only slightly. Everyone was still nervous. That said, he waved his wand and removed the sheets covering the cages, revealing the cursed spirits. In the 4 cages made of a special alchemical material, 4 cursed spirits appeared, all 4 of them as grotesque as possible, clearly chosen to make a significant impact on the new students. "Disgusting." That was the sentiment shared by everyone as they saw the grotesque monsters writhing in the cages. Some, with more sensitive minds, bent over and vomited immediately. No one blamed or mocked these teenagers. The cursed spirits in the cages were truly disgusting, with a repulsive mass of fat and eyes that twisted grotesquely. Edward spoke calmly, his gray eyes observing everyone with serenity. "Some of you are here to determine whether you will be assigned to the exorcism course or the auxiliary course. Although the school may make this choice based on your performance at the end of the school year, it respects your opinions. Therefore, you can choose now whether you want to remain in the exorcism course or switch to the auxiliary course." He continued calmly, "There is no shame in being in the auxiliary course. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. If you believe you will do better in the auxiliary course, do not hesitate to make that choice. But it's not necessary to decide now, you have until the end of the school year to choose. Otherwise, the school will make the decision for you." Every word from Edward had a profound impact on the hearts of these teenagers, who expected a world full of brightness and magic. However, reality was cruel. They were not just students but soldiers in training. "Let's begin," he said. Unlike humans, cursed spirits can regenerate infinitely as long as they have negative magical energy, so the easiest method to kill them in most cases is to cut off the head and destroy the body. But it's not a mandatory rule. Some may still survive even with their body cut into 4 parts. Edward continued his lecture regardless of what the students were thinking. To provide an example, he drew his wand and incanted a spell towards the cursed spirit in the cage. Bombarda. A red flash appeared at the tip of Edward's wand and struck the cursed spirit, exploding a significant portion of the creature, splattering purple blood to the sides, staining the ground with a purple hue, and a putrid smell hung in the air. Such a bloody scene left all the students pale, but they all looked with a certain curiosity as the monstrosity regenerated extremely quickly, and within seconds, it seemed intact again, as if nothing had happened. Indifferent to the bloody scene, Edward lowered his wand and explained sternly, "That's the healing factor of cursed spirits, so when you're on a mission, never let your guard down under any circumstances, as like any living creature, cursed spirits also have a basic instinct for self-preservation." Listening to the entire lecture and vivid example, Asterion nodded in satisfaction. Edward was worthy of being a veteran Auror. The man knew how to teach survival without kind and flowery words. The reality was much crueler, as the man personally demonstrated. "He's a good teacher, not a charlatan with blonde hair and impeccably white teeth," Asterion said to his small, private group, not forgetting to ridicule a certain plagiarizing writer. Though they didn't quite understand the second part, everyone nodded in agreement with his words. They could also see that Edward was a good teacher. He didn't hesitate to expose cruelty and blood to the new students, shattering the beautiful illusion that teenagers had about the wizarding world. Next chapter, Chapter 49 First Class of Defense Against Cursed Spirits, 2, Chapter 50 Request, 1, Chapter 51 Request, 2, Chapter 52 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 1, Chapter 53 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 2, Chapter 54 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 3, Chapter 55 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 4, Chapter 56 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 1, Chapter 57 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 2, Chapter 58 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 3, Chapter 59 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 4, Chapter 60 School Council, Chapter 61 Mission, 1, Chapter 62 Mission, 2, Chapter 63 Mission, 3, Chapter 64 Mission, 4, Chapter 65 Mission, 5, Chapter 66 Consequences of the Attack, 1, Chapter 67 Consequences of the Attack, 2, Chapter 68 Invasion of Hogwarts, 1, Chapter 69 Invasion of Hogwarts, 2, Chapter 70 Invasion of Hogwarts, 3, Chapter 71 Invasion of Hogwarts, 4, Chapter 72 Invasion of Hogwarts, 5, Chapter 73 Invasion of Hogwarts, 6. Chapter 49 First Class of Defense Against Cursed Spirits, 2, Are you okay, Mione? Rose asked, concerned, observing her friend's pale face. Just shocked by everything, Hermione whispered, looking at the purple blood spreading with a repugnant sound. She knew about cursed spirits, but she had only seen small and insignificant ones until now. Witnessing one so grotesque up close and the bloody scene deeply impacted her. For the first time, she felt that the wizarding world wasn't as bright as she had previously imagined. It was a world based on blood and power, cold and prejudiced against people like her. However, the curly-haired girl didn't let herself be frightened for long. She had the determination to stand firm in this world, and she would. She didn't want to be just another statistic reported on TV and would protect her parents. Rose, have you seen worse? Hermione asked without taking her eyes off the cursed spirits in the cages. Yes, much worse. These monsters are truly disgusting when they're devouring people. Rose didn't hold back and spoke calmly. In her eyes, it was much better for Hermione to get used to the concept of death as soon as possible to avoid accidentally harming herself in the future. Hermione seemed to take a deep breath, clenching her fists as she spoke. Rose, can you help me get stronger? I won't go easy on you, Mione, Rose said, looking at the girl with a smile. No need to go easy, Hermione replied determinedly. Rose smiled and continued to listen to the professor. Each house, form a line and approach the cages, Edward ordered coldly, regardless of the pale faces of the teenagers. In the Slytherin line, don't you dare vomit on me, Zabini, Theodore taunted his friend with a challenging look. Those are my words, Blaise replied calmly. Boys are so childish, Tracy murmured, rolling her eyes as she watched the two. Beside her, Daphne nodded in agreement as she approached Asterion, seeking some comfort as she leaned her body against his. Unfortunately for her, Asterion simply coldly withdrew and said, Daphne, I understand it's scary, but you must face your fears head-on. Seeking comfort won't save you in the future. Daphne felt abandoned upon hearing his cold words. Although she knew he said it for her own good, she still looked at her future husband with resentment and turned her face away, refusing to meet his gaze. Then, Daphne and Tracy muttered quietly to each other, casting critical glances at Asterion. Asterion simply shrugged, indifferent. He wouldn't go easy on her just because she would be his wife, on the contrary, he would be especially demanding of her. Although Daphne's chances of becoming a special grade witch were slim, they were much higher than most witches. With rigorous training and a bit of luck, Daphne would have a significant chance of achieving that status. The first in line from Slytherin was Asterion, who looked boredly at the cursed spirit. Unlike the other first-year students, he was familiar with cursed spirits, especially with the horrible taste they left behind. I heard of your work exorcising special grade cursed spirits, Lord Black, Edward said, looking at Asterion with hidden admiration behind his stern gaze. Not as good as I hoped, Asterion murmured, staring coldly at the cursed spirit. Suddenly, the image of 20,000 bodies flooded his mind, and for a brief moment, his bloodlust leaked out, drastically lowering the temperature around him. The students around felt a sudden chill and rubbed their arms, puzzled by the sudden drop in temperature. Lord Black, Edward spoke with a tone louder than usual. Asterion snapped out of his reverie and looked apologetically at the man, suppressing his bloodlust. Professor, will these images ever disappear? Asterion asked in a low voice. After that, one by one, everyone faced their fears head-on. Some were terrified, others vomited again at the sight of a cursed spirit up close, while some tried to appear calm, or at least, controlled. But Asterion doubted that any student present would dream of anything good tonight. This was a truly memorable experience for everyone. The class ended with the last person facing the cursed spirits. The next defense against cursed spirits class will be in a month, by which time you will probably have learned some lethal spells from Professor Flitwick, announced Edward, his voice echoing and capturing everyone's attention. A shared thought formed in the minds of the students. We're going to fight cursed spirits. Yes, it's exactly as you're thinking, you'll be facing cursed spirits, confirmed Edward, as if he were reading their minds, his cold voice reinforcing everyone's concerns. He continued regardless of the incredulous expressions on their faces. Before you go, I'll give you a tip. Instead of socializing and playing with friends, I advise you to study well. Because I'll only help you when your life is at risk, which means I'll remain indifferent to broken bones and fractured ribs. Everyone swallowed hard upon hearing this. They definitely wouldn't die, but the prospect of getting hurt was almost a certainty in the professor's words. It terrified them completely. No one wanted to end up with a broken arm or leg, especially while fighting cursed spirits. Unconcerned with the students' reaction, Edward left without looking back, leaving behind hundreds of students alone with the cursed spirits still in the cages. The atmosphere became even more tense and frightening. The outdoor classroom quickly emptied out, with students practically running outside. Even with the cursed spirits still trapped, no one wanted to be near them without a teacher present. Asterion almost laughed seeing everyone panicked, thinking they would have to face a powerful cursed spirit. He was almost certain they would be grade 4 or 3 cursed spirits, nothing too dangerous, but the students didn't seem to think so. Daph, I'm going to study hard from now on, said Tracy, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She was clearly nervous about the class next month. Daphne beside her also didn't seem calm at all. The news came very suddenly, and she was still processing the whole situation, even though she was almost a grade 1 witch. It showed how lack of experience could affect even someone with some training like her. Even the most talkative in the group, Theodore, was silent, thinking about the next class. Blaze seemed to be the calmest of the group, his expression remaining serene despite the tense atmosphere. "They can't do this. If something happens to me, I'll tell my father," exclaimed a loud and fearful voice, causing everyone to look at the platinum blonde teenager with a strange look. "If I were your sister, I'd break off my engagement," Tracy said with a playful tone, the teenager managing to change the entire atmosphere of the class with her sudden outburst. Daphne looked at Draco and shook her head, thanking Merlin that her husband would be Asterion, not Draco. Although Asterion seemed cold most of the time, she knew that behind that icy exterior, he was a lovely and loving marshmallow with his own family. Compared to the spoiled Draco, Asterion was the perfect husband in her eyes, powerful, handsome, coming from a powerful family, and loving, in his own cold way. The other members of Slytherin couldn't help but look strangely at the Malfoy heir. So what if his father was part of the school board? This was Hogwarts, even the most powerful wizard in the world couldn't control it, let alone his father. Doria Malfoy even distanced herself from her twin brother when she noticed the looks she was receiving. She glanced irritably at Draco and remained silent. Even if she said something, he would ignore her. It had always been like that. Her father, Lucius, always favored Draco over her, despite her showing more talent. But in his eyes, she was just a girl who would marry and leave the family. Next chapter, Chapter 50 Request, 1, Chapter 51 Request, 2, Chapter 52 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 1, Chapter 53 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 2, Chapter 54 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 3, Chapter 55 A Treacherous Game of Chess, 4, Chapter 56 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class. 1, Chapter 57 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 2, Chapter 58 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 3, Chapter 59 Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 4, Chapter 60 School Council, Chapter 61 Mission, 1, Chapter 62 Mission, 2, Chapter 63 Mission, 3, Chapter 64 Mission, 4, Chapter 65 Mission, 5, Chapter 66 Consequences of the Attack, 1, Chapter 67 Consequences of the Attack, 2, Chapter 68. Invasion of Hogwarts, 1, Chapter 69 Invasion of Hogwarts, 2, Chapter 70 Invasion of Hogwarts, 3, Chapter 71 Invasion of Hogwarts, 4, Chapter 72 Invasion of Hogwarts, 5, Chapter 73 Invasion of Hogwarts, 6. Chapter 50 Request, 1, 3 weeks later. In the Hufflepuff common room, a young adult was holding her own purple hair in frustration. "Why is it so hard to talk to him?" Tonks lamented, collapsing onto the couch, her voice laden with helplessness and sadness. Her hair changed color from purple to gray. She had tried to reach out to her cousin, but he spent most of his days in the Slytherin common room, and when he wasn't there, he was in the library in the forbidden section where she couldn't enter. During classes, they couldn't meet since she was in her 7th year and he was in his 1st. It was as if fate was conspiring to keep them apart forever. Tonks didn't want to resort to it, but she was considering breaking into the Slytherin common room, which was a terrible idea. If caught, all Slytherins would be her enemies, and she might even be expelled for breaking one of Hogwarts' most important rules. Biting her nails anxiously, she made a decision: screw the consequences. Her hair suddenly changed from gray to pink. Tonks stood up, leaving the Hufflepuff common room, and suddenly changed her appearance, transforming into a Ravenclaw student. She walked through the corridors of Hogwarts in search of a Slytherin, something she had never imagined herself doing. After a while, she spotted a platinum blonde teenage girl with an arrogant demeanor. She recognized the girl as Doria Malfoy, one of the 2 princesses of Slytherin, alongside Daphne Greengrass, the Ice Queen. The girl was a typical Slytherin through and through. Seeing Doria heading towards the library, Tonks felt a surge of determination. As she turned the corner, she transformed into Doria and confidently strode towards the dungeons, where the Slytherin common room was located, beneath the Black Lake. Upon reaching the entrance, Tonks looked at the massive door adorned with a silver serpent and didn't hesitate to speak the password. Pure blood. As the door opened, a smug smile formed on Tonks' lips. Slytherins were easily predictable, and this time was no different. Upon entering the common room, Tonks couldn't help but widen her eyes at the luxury and elegance of the place. It was a bit dim, but the entire ambience seemed magnificent and filled with refinement, in shades of green, silver, and black. The black wooden furniture was beautifully carved with snakes. The whole room was a spectacle to behold. Tonks didn't want to admit it, but she felt a twinge of envy. It seemed like the entire school budget had been invested in the Slytherin common room. Shaking her head to refocus, she searched for her cousin, and to her surprise, she found him. He was by the fireplace, seated on an elegant chair that looked more like a throne than a simple seat. He read a newspaper while a nearly empty glass of wine rested on the nearby side table. Tonks couldn't help but feel that her cousin certainly knew how to enjoy life. At the same time, she couldn't help but notice that he looked like one of those villainous princes that would make any teenager fall for the bad boy vibe. As she pondered this, Tonks approached arrogantly and sat in the chair next to him, a chair that resembled a throne, but more elegant and silver in color, unlike the black throne where her cousin was seated. Asterion noticed her presence and furrowed his brow in confusion. "Hello, Asterion," she said with a sweet and gentle voice, like a teenager vaguely expressing her crush. Tonks was secretly proud of her performance, she felt like she deserved an Oscar. But his next words made Tonks' body stiffen, her presumption disappearing as quickly as it came. "You're not Doria." Asterion couldn't help but feel a certain amusement with the situation before him. "So, who are you?" Closing the newspaper, Asterion asked, his eyes shining with slight interest. He observed the fake Doria and noticed that her magical aura was similar to Doria's, but Doria Malfoy herself didn't like him, so it was impossible for her to speak in that tone with him, especially sitting on the throne he had prepared for Daphne beside him. Hierarchy in Slytherin was strict, and such an act of disrespect would not be tolerated. Suddenly, to his surprised eyes, Doria's appearance began to undergo an impressive transformation. Her body changed, first in height, then in skin color, followed by facial features, and finally, her hair. Asterion watched the transformation with interest. In place of the blonde, emerged a young adult with purple hair and black eyes. She bore a certain resemblance to someone he knew, especially in the cheekbones. Asterion recognized the process. The young woman was a metamorphmagus, a talent that seemed to commonly appear in the Black family. A very powerful talent for infiltration and combat, as it could alter even the body's composition, making it as hard as steel or as light as a feather. The young woman had a somewhat embarrassed smile, which Asterion could understand. "If you wanted to get close to me, you should have chosen my fiancé or Tracy. Both are close to me, unlike Doria, who hates me to the core," commented Asterion as he finished the last sip of wine in his glass. "But it didn't seem like she hated you, in the occasions I saw you two together," the woman asked, confused. "Well, Slytherin has a rule, to be united outside the common room. Conflicts should always remain within the common room." The young woman opened her mouth, surprised and unsure of what to say. "So, who are you?" Asterion asked again, his red eyes shining slightly as he observed the young woman beside him. Nymph squirmed in her chair and spoke with an embarrassed tone. "I know it must be strange, but I'm your cousin, Nymph Tonks." Asterion's expression remained unchanged. "Aren't you surprised?" Nymph asked, noticing his lack of reaction to the revelation. "I have many cousins, Miss Tonks." "One more is not so surprising," replied Asterion, reaching for a bottle of wine from the shadow beside him and refilling his glass. "But let's talk about you. Why did you come to me?" Swirling the glass in smooth, circular motions, he asked, looking at her with his red eyes. Honestly, he already knew who Nymph was, or rather, Nymphadora.